The Greek underworld did not emerge as a fully formed concept in ancient religious thought, but evolved from primordial forces that predated the organized pantheon of gods. To understand the underworld's place in Greek cosmology, we must begin with chaos, the yawning void that existed before all creation. This primordial emptiness was not merely an absence of matter, but represented the fundamental state of undifferentiated potential from which all cosmic forces would eventually emerge. Hesiod's Theogony, composed in the 8th century BC, provides our most comprehensive early account of these cosmic origins. According to Hesiod, chaos came into being first, followed by Gaia, Tartarus, and Eros. This sequence reveals the ancient Greek understanding of reality's fundamental structure. The void, the solid foundation of existence, the deep abyss, and the force that would drive creation and procreation. Tartarus, specifically described as existing in the depths of the wide-pathed earth, represents the earliest conceptualization of what would become the underworld's deepest region. The emergence of Erebus from chaos marks another crucial development in underworld cosmology. Erebus embodied primordial darkness, not simply as the absence of light, but as a tangible cosmic force with its own generative power. This darkness was fundamentally different from the darkness experienced in the mortal world. It possessed a quality of depth and permanence that would characterize the underworld throughout Greek religious thought. From Erebus and Nyx came Aether and Hemera, establishing the cosmic rhythm of light and darkness that would govern both the world of the living and the realm of the dead. Nyx herself occupies a particularly significant position in the genealogy of underworld deities. Ancient sources describe her as dwelling in Tartarus, in a house where she and Hemera alternately emerge to bring night and day to the world. This cosmic arrangement established the underworld not as a completely separate realm, but as an integral part of the universe's functioning. Nyx's dwelling in Tartarus created the first permanent divine residence in what would become the underworld, establishing precedent for the later rule of Hades and Persephone. The offspring of Nyx reveal the conceptual framework that would define the underworld's domain over death, sleep, and the boundary between conscious and unconscious states. Thanatos emerged as the personification of death itself, depicted in early sources as a winged figure with an inexorable nature. Unlike later representations that might portray death as violent or terrifying, Thanatos in these primordial accounts was simply inevitable, a force of nature as fundamental as the rising and setting of the sun. His twin brother Hypnos shared similar characteristics, dwelling in a cave near the entrance to the underworld, where poppies grew and the river Lethe flowed nearby. The relationship between Thanatos and Hypnos illustrates early Greek understanding of death as closely related to sleep but fundamentally different in its permanence. Both brothers possessed the ability to overcome mortals and gods alike, though Thanatos' grip could never be loosened once applied. This conceptual pairing established sleep as a temporary death and death as an eternal sleep, creating a theological framework that would influence Greek attitudes toward mortality for centuries. Nyx also bore other offspring crucial to underworld cosmology: the Moirai, who determined the lifespan and destiny of mortals, Nemesis, who ensured divine retribution, and the Onoroi, who travelled between the world of sleep and waking consciousness. These deities collectively established the underworld's authority over human destiny, justice, and the liminal spaces between different states of being. The physical geography of these primordial realms, as described in early sources, reveals sophisticated theological thinking about the universe's structure. Tartarus was conceived as existing at a distance below the earth equal to the distance between earth and sky. A bronze anvil dropped from heaven would fall for 9 days before reaching Earth, and another 9 days before reaching Tartarus. This mathematical precision in cosmic geography suggests that early Greek religious thought viewed the universe as an ordered system with clearly defined boundaries and relationships between its component parts. Now, the distinction between different levels of the underworld began with these primordial arrangements. Erebus occupied the space immediately below the Earth's surface, while Tartarus extended to the cosmic depths. This vertical stratification would later accommodate different categories of the dead and different types of divine punishment or reward. The primordial deities established territories within these regions based on their specific functions and relationships to the cosmic order. Early Greek religious thought carefully distinguished between the physical earth where mortals lived and the shadowy domain beneath. This distinction was not merely spatial but ontological. The underworld operated according to different natural laws and temporal rhythms. In the realm of the living, time moved forward in linear fashion, seasons changed, and mortals experienced birth, growth, and death. In the underworld, time became circular or static. Seasons held no meaning, and existence took on qualities of permanence and repetition. The emergence of Gaia as the Earth goddess created the physical boundary between these realms while also connecting them. Gaia's body formed the solid foundation upon which mortals lived, but her depths contained the passages and caverns that led to the underworld. This intimate connection between Earth and underworld meant that the realm of the dead was not conceived as completely separate from the world of the living, but as its hidden foundation and inevitable destination. The primordial forces also established the underworld's relationship to cosmic justice and order. Tartarus served not only as the deepest region of the underworld, but as the cosmic prison where beings who threatened the fundamental order of reality could be contained. The Titans, after their defeat by Zeus, were imprisoned in Tartarus, establishing precedent for the underworld's role in maintaining cosmic stability through the containment and punishment of disruptive forces. These early cosmological arrangements created the theological foundation for later developments in Greek underworld mythology. The authority of Hades and Persephone, the geography of different underworld regions, the roles of various chthonic deities, and the complex relationships between life, death, and divine justice all derive from patterns established in these primordial accounts. The underworld's position as both the destination of the dead and the source of Earth's fertility, its role in cosmic justice and individual destiny, and its function as a realm where different natural laws applied, all originated in these foundational cosmic arrangements. The sophistication of this early cosmological thinking becomes apparent when examining how these primordial forces interacted to create a coherent theological system. Rather than simply describing the underworld as a place where dead people went, early Greek religious thought conceived it as an integral part of cosmic function, populated by deities whose roles were essential to the universe's proper operation. This integration of underworld theology with broader cosmic understanding would influence Greek religious practice, artistic representation, and philosophical speculation for over a millennium. The primordial forces that shape the cosmic foundations of the underworld set the stage for one of the most significant conflicts in Greek mythology, the Titanomachy, a war that would fundamentally reshape the divine hierarchy and establish the rule of the Olympian gods. This 10-year struggle between the younger generation of gods, led by Zeus, and the older Titans under Cronus, represented far more than a simple succession myth. It was a cosmic revolution that determined which divine powers would control the fundamental forces of existence, including death itself. Cronus, having overthrown his own father Uranus, ruled the cosmos with an iron grip, but his reign was marked by a paranoid fear of being supplanted by his own children. The prophecy that one of his offspring would overthrow him drove Cronus to swallow each child immediately upon birth. Rhea, his wife, managed to save only Zeus by substituting a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes for the infant. Zeus grew to maturity in secret on the island of Crete, nurtured by the goat Amalthea and protected by the Curetes, whose clashing weapons masked his cries. When Zeus reached adulthood, he initiated his campaign against Cronus by forcing his father to regurgitate his swallowed siblings. The emetic that accomplished this feat varied in different accounts, sometimes described as a potion prepared by Metis, sometimes as mustard mixed with wine. The emergence of Hades, Poseidon, Hestia, Demeter, and Hera from their father's stomach marked the beginning of the new divine order. These gods, despite having been swallowed as infants, emerged fully grown and ready for battle, their time in Cronus' stomach having somehow accelerated their development to divine maturity. The war itself raged across multiple cosmic domains. The Titans established their stronghold on Mount Othrys, while Zeus and his siblings claimed Mount Olympus as their base of operations. The conflict's scale was unprecedented, with battles that shook the foundations of earth and heaven. Mountains were hurled like projectiles, seas boiled from the intensity of divine fire, and the very structure of reality trembled under the assault of cosmic forces unleashed without restraint. The turning point came when Zeus freed the Cyclopes from their imprisonment in Tartarus. These one-eyed giants, grateful for their liberation, forged weapons of immense power for the three brothers who would divide the cosmos. For Zeus, they created the Thunderbolt, a weapon that could split mountains and command the very forces of the sky. Poseidon received the trident, capable of causing earthquakes and controlling all bodies of water. For Hades, they crafted the helmet of invisibility, known as the Kuni or the Cap of Hades, which rendered its wearer completely undetectable to both divine and mortal senses. The strategic importance of Hades' helmet became immediately apparent in the war's climactic phases. While Zeus wielded his thunderbolts in direct confrontation, and Poseidon used his trident to destabilize the Titans' positions, Hades employed stealth and infiltration. Ancient sources describe how he would appear suddenly behind enemy lines, his invisible presence sowing confusion and terror among the Titans. The psychological impact of an unseen enemy proved as devastating as any direct assault, as Titan forces found themselves constantly looking over their shoulders, never knowing when or where Hades might strike. The hundred-handed ones, the Hecatonchires, also played a crucial role after Zeus freed them from Tartarus. These giants, Cottus, Briareus and Gyges, each possessed 50 heads and 100 arms, allowing them to hurl massive boulders with unprecedented speed and accuracy. Their addition to Zeus's forces provided the overwhelming firepower necessary to break the Titans' resistance. The combined assault of thunderbolts from above, earthquakes from below, invisible attacks from Hades, and the relentless stone barrage from the Hecatonchires finally shattered Titan resistance. The defeat of the Titans was total and decisive. Most were cast into Tartarus, the deepest region of the Underworld, where they were imprisoned behind bronze gates and walls. The Hecatonchires became their eternal guards, ensuring that no Titan could ever again threaten the cosmic order. Atlas received special punishment, condemned to hold up the heavens for eternity, while Prometheus would later face his own distinctive torment for his theft of fire. With victory achieved, the three brothers faced the question of how to divide their conquered domains. The method of division varies in different ancient sources, but the most commonly accepted account describes a three-way lottery. Zeus received the heavens and the upper air, establishing him as the supreme ruler of the gods and the master of weather and celestial phenomena. Poseidon gained dominion over the seas and all waters, making him lord of the ocean depths and the earthquakes that originated beneath the earth's surface. Hades drew the underworld, becoming ruler of the dead and sovereign of all the hidden wealth beneath the earth's surface. This division was not arbitrary, but reflected each brother's characteristics and the weapons they had wielded during the war. Zeus's mastery of the thunderbolt made him the natural choice for ruling the sky and weather. Poseidon's trident connected him to the fluid, changeable nature of water and the violent power of earthquakes. Hades' helmet of invisibility aligned him with the hidden, mysterious realm of the dead, where the invisible souls of mortals would dwell after their physical deaths. The earth itself remained neutral territory, accessible to all three brothers but belonging exclusively to none. This arrangement established the complex relationships between different divine spheres while maintaining cosmic balance. Mortals would live on the Earth's surface under Zeus's ultimate authority, sail Poseidon's seas, and eventually descend to Hades' realm upon death. The three brothers' domains were thus interconnected and interdependent rather than completely separate. Hades' acceptance of the underworld as his domain marked a crucial transformation in his divine identity. The name Hades itself derives from the Greek aides, meaning unseen or invisible, directly connecting to his helmet and his realm's hidden nature. This etymology reveals how the Greeks understood the fundamental character of death and the afterlife as a transition from the visible world of the living to the invisible realm of the dead. The god and his domain shared this essential quality of hiddenness, making Hades both the ruler of the underworld and its personification. Ancient sources preserve numerous epithets for Hades that illuminate different aspects of his dual nature as both deity and realm. Pluton, or Pluto, meaning wealth giver or rich one, emphasized his dominion over the earth's mineral wealth and agricultural fertility. This epithet reflected the belief that precious metals, gems, and the fertile soil necessary for crops all originated in his underground domain. The connection between death and wealth was not paradoxical but logical. The earth that received the dead also produced the resources necessary for life. Polydegmon, meaning receiver of many, highlighted Hades' role as the universal destination for all mortals regardless of their status, wealth, or achievements in life. Unlike other gods who might favour particular cities, professions, or types of people, Hades received everyone equally. This epithet emphasized the democratic nature of death and the underworld's function as the great equalizer that rendered meaningless all earthly distinctions. Stygios, referring to the river Styx, connected Hades to the most sacred oath in the divine realm. When gods swore by the Styx, they bound themselves with unbreakable vows, and Hades as lord of this river became the ultimate guarantor of divine promises. This aspect of his authority extended beyond the realm of the dead to encompass cosmic justice and the reliability of divine word. The establishment of Hades' rule required more than simply claiming the underworld as his territory. He needed to organize the realm's administration, establish its laws and customs, and create the infrastructure necessary to process the constant influx of souls from the world above. The underworld under Hades became a complex bureaucratic system with different regions for different types of souls, various divine servants with specialized functions and elaborate procedures for judging and assigning the dead to their eternal destinations. Hades' character, as depicted in ancient literature, reveals a deity quite different from the evil figure he would become in later traditions. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey present him as stern but just, inflexible in his adherence to cosmic law, but not cruel or malicious. He maintained the boundaries between life and death with absolute consistency, rarely allowing exceptions to the natural order. When heroes like Heracles or Orpheus ventured into his realm, Hades treated them with the respect due to their divine connections while firmly upholding his domain's rules. The cap of invisibility remained one of Hades' most distinctive attributes throughout Greek literature. Unlike Zeus's thunderbolt or Poseidon's trident, which were primarily weapons of destruction, Hades' helmet served multiple functions. It allowed him to move unseen through both the underworld and the world above, observing mortal and divine affairs without being detected. This ability made him privy to secrets and hidden knowledge that other gods could not access, contributing to his reputation for wisdom and understanding of cosmic mysteries. The helmet also symbolized the fundamental nature of death itself, its inevitability and its mystery. Just as Hades could appear anywhere unseen, death could strike anyone at any time without warning. The invisibility represented not only physical concealment, but the unknowable nature of what lay beyond death. Mortals could not see into Hades' realm or understand its true nature until they experienced death themselves. Hades' role as ruler required him to maintain order among the various categories of beings in his domain. The ordinary dead formed the vast majority of his subjects, but he also governed the Titans imprisoned in Tartarus, the heroes dwelling in the Elysian fields, and various monsters and supernatural beings that belong to the Underworld's darker regions. Each group required different treatment and management, making Hades' administrative responsibilities enormously complex. The god's reputation for fairness stemmed from his consistent application of cosmic law rather than personal favoritism or arbitrary decision-making. Ancient sources emphasize that Hades never showed partiality based on wealth, status, or personal relationships. Kings and slaves received identical treatment in death, and even his divine relatives could expect no special consideration when dealing with underworld law. This inflexibility, while sometimes seeming harsh, maintained the cosmic balance necessary for the proper functioning of the universe. The most significant event in establishing Hades' complete authority over his realm was his abduction of Persephone, daughter of Demeter. This event, known as the Harpagmos or seizing, fundamentally altered both the underworld's nature and the world's seasonal patterns. Persephone, originally called Kor, was gathering flowers in a meadow when the earth opened, and Hades emerged in his chariot to carry her away to his underground palace. The abduction of Persephone marks not only the establishment of Hades' complete dominion over the underworld, but also the beginning of its transformation from a primordial cosmic region into a structured realm with distinct geographical features and architectural marvels. The underworld that emerged from this foundational myth bore the characteristics of both a natural landscape and a carefully designed administrative centre, reflecting the dual nature of death as both a natural process and a divine judgment. The entrance to the underworld presented itself through various geographical features across the ancient Mediterranean world, though certain locations held particular significance in Greek religious thought. The most prominent entrance lay near Lake Avernus in Campania, where volcanic gases created an atmosphere so toxic that birds flying overhead would fall dead, giving the lake its name from the Greek ornos, meaning without birds. The Acheron River in Epirus provided another major gateway, its dark waters flowing through a landscape of limestone caves and underground channels that seemed to lead directly into the Earth's depths. Cape Tanarum in Laconia, where a cave system extended deep into the Peloponnese, served as the entrance through which Heracles dragged Cerberus during his 12th labour. These physical entrances were guarded by architectural structures that varied in different ancient accounts, but consistently emphasized the finality of crossing from the world of the living into the realm of the dead. The gates of Hades, forged from adamantine and reinforced with bronze, stood as massive barriers that could be opened only from within. Their construction defied mortal understanding, as the gates appeared to be simultaneously made of the hardest substances known to ancient metallurgy, while also possessing qualities that allowed them to respond to the approach of souls. The gates recognized the difference between the living and the dead, remaining sealed against unauthorized entry while opening automatically for souls whose time had come. Beyond the gates, the geography of the underworld revealed itself as a vast subterranean landscape that followed its own natural laws. The realm extended in all directions beneath the Earth's surface, its boundaries limited only by the cosmic distance that separated it from Tartarus below and the mortal world above. Unlike the surface world, where mountains, valleys, and bodies of water followed patterns established by geological processes, the underworld's terrain reflected the metaphysical requirements of processing and housing the dead. The most immediate region encountered by newly arrived souls was Erebus, the realm of primordial darkness that had existed since the cosmos's earliest formation. Here, the landscape consisted of shadowy plains where the light of neither sun nor moon could penetrate. The darkness was not merely the absence of light, but possessed a tangible quality that seemed to muffle sound and slow movement. Newly dead souls wandered these plains in a state of confusion, gradually adjusting to their incorporeal existence while awaiting the judgment that would determine their final destination. The architecture within Erebus reflected its function as a transitional space. Vast pavilions constructed from materials that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light provided shelter for souls still processing their transition from life to death. These structures possessed no fixed form, appearing different to each soul based on their cultural background and personal associations with shelter and comfort. A Greek warrior might perceive a structure resembling a military tent, while a farmer would see something akin to a rural dwelling, yet both would be experiencing the same metaphysical architecture adapted to their individual needs. The rivers of Hades formed the most distinctive geographical features of the Underworld, each possessing unique properties that served specific functions in the realm's operation. The Styx, whose name derived from the Greek word for hatred or abhorrence, flowed as a dark torrent that encircled the Underworld 9 times, creating an impenetrable barrier between the realm of the dead and the world above. Its waters possessed the power to make unbreakable oaths, and even Zeus himself was bound by vows sworn upon the Styx. The river's banks were lined with black poplars and willows, trees sacred to the Underworld whose pale leaves rustled with sounds that resembled whispered secrets. Charon, the ferryman of the Styx, operated from a dock constructed of black marble that extended into the river's turbulent waters. His boat, crafted from cypress wood and reinforced with bronze fittings, possessed the supernatural ability to expand or contract based on the number of souls requiring transport. The vessel's construction incorporated materials from both the world of the living and the realm of the dead, allowing it to navigate the boundary between these realms without suffering damage from the Styx's corrosive properties. The river Lethe, flowing with waters of forgetfulness, carved a meandering course through the Underworld's central regions. Unlike the Styx's violent current, Lethe moved with a gentle hypnotic flow that seemed to draw observers into contemplation of its depths. The riverbanks were covered with poppies and other plants, associated with sleep and dreams, creating a landscape that induced drowsiness in those who approached. Souls who drank from Lethe's waters lost all memory of their previous existence, though the process was gradual rather than instantaneous, allowing for the careful regulation of which memories were erased and which might be preserved for specific purposes. Acheron, the river of woe and pain, flowed as a wide, sluggish stream through the Underworld's more desolate regions. Its waters appeared muddy and thick, carrying the sediment of countless tears shed by both the living and the dead. The river's course passed through landscapes of particular bleakness, where the architecture consisted primarily of monuments to suffering and loss. These structures, built from grey stone that seemed to weep perpetual moisture, served as gathering places for souls whose lives had been marked by exceptional tragedy, or whose deaths had caused particular anguish to those left behind. The Cocytus, River of Lamentation, manifested as a network of smaller streams and tributaries that carried the sounds of mourning throughout the Underworld. The river's unique property was its ability to transmit the voices of the grieving from the world above to the realms of the dead below, allowing deceased souls to hear the lamentations of their surviving relatives and friends. The banks of Cocytus were lined with acoustic structures resembling amphitheatres, where souls could gather to listen to the mourning songs and funeral rites being performed in their honour in the world above. Phlegethon, the river of fire, flowed as a torrent of liquid flame through the Underworld's regions, designated for punishment and purification. Unlike ordinary fire, Phlegethon's flames possessed the ability to burn away spiritual impurities without destroying the essential nature of souls. The river's course was contained within channels carved from fire-resistant stone, and its banks were lined with forges and workshops where various underworld deities crafted implements for judgment and punishment. The architectural structures surrounding Phlegethon incorporated the flowing fire into their design, creating buildings that were simultaneously illuminated and heated by the river's passage. The Asphodel Meadows occupied the largest geographical area within the Underworld, serving as the destination for the vast majority of souls who had lived neither exceptionally virtuous nor particularly wicked lives. This region presented itself as an endless plain covered with pale, ghostly flowers that gave off a faint luminescence in the underworld's perpetual twilight. The asphodels grew in patterns that seemed random, but actually followed complex mathematical relationships that reflected the cosmic order governing the distribution of souls. The architecture within the asphodel meadows consisted primarily of simple dwellings that provided basic shelter without luxury or discomfort. These structures were constructed from a material that resembled marble, but possessed a translucent quality that allowed the asphodel flowers' glow to shine through their walls. The buildings could accommodate any number of souls, expanding or contracting as needed, and their interiors adapted to provide each inhabitant with familiar surroundings that recalled their mortal homes without reproducing them exactly. Tartarus, the deepest region of the underworld, served as both prison and place of punishment for those who had committed crimes against the cosmic order. The geography of Tartarus consisted of a vast pit surrounded by triple walls of bronze, with gates forged by the Cyclopes that could be opened only by specific divine authorization. The region's architecture reflected its punitive function, with structures designed to contain and torment rather than comfort or shelter. The most prominent architectural feature within Tartarus was the prison complex that housed the defeated Titans. This structure, built from adamantine and reinforced with chains forged in the cosmic fires that had raged during the Titanomachy, stretched across a significant portion of Tartarus's geography. The prison's design incorporated elements that prevented escape through any conceivable means, including walls that extended infinitely in all directions and floors that could not be broken by even divine strength. Individual punishment chambers within Tartarus were custom designed for specific offenders, with architecture that reflected the nature of their crimes. Tantalus stood in a pool beneath fruit trees, both of which receded whenever he attempted to satisfy his hunger or thirst, within a chamber whose walls displayed images of the feast where he had served his own son to the gods. Sisyphus pushed his boulder up a slope within a circular chamber whose walls ensured that the stone would always roll back down just before reaching the summit. The Elysian Fields, also known as Elysium, represented the underworld's most pleasant region, reserved for heroes, the especially virtuous, and those favoured by the gods. The geography of Elysium resembled an idealized version of the Mediterranean landscape, with rolling hills covered in perfect grass, groves of trees that bore fruit year-round, and streams of clear, sweet water that never ran dry. The climate remained perpetually spring-like, with gentle breezes and comfortable temperatures that required neither heating nor cooling. The architecture within Elysium reflected its status as a reward rather than merely a destination. Palaces constructed from materials that seemed to capture and reflect light created residences worthy of the heroes and virtuous souls who dwelt there. These buildings incorporated precious metals and gems not for ostentation, but because these materials possessed properties that enhanced the spiritual well-being of their inhabitants. Gold provided warmth and comfort, silver offered clarity of thought, and various precious stones contributed specific benefits to the soul's continued development. The central administrative complex of the underworld was dominated by the Palace of Hades and Persephone, a structure that combined the functions of royal residence, courthouse, and administrative centre. The palace's architecture reflected the dual nature of its rulers, with sections designed in the stark, imposing style appropriate to the Lord of the Dead alongside areas that incorporated the gentler influences of Persephone's connection to life and growth. The judgment seat, where the three judges of the dead, Minos, Rhadamanthus and Aeacus, determined the fate of arriving souls, occupied a prominent position within the palace complex. This structure was designed as an amphitheatre with perfect acoustics, allowing the judges to hear even the whispered confessions of souls while ensuring that their verdicts could be clearly understood by all present. The seat itself was carved from a single block of black marble that had been present in the underworld since its primordial formation. connecting the judgment process to the cosmic order established at creation. Different ancient sources provided varying descriptions of the underworld's layout and features, reflecting the evolution of Greek religious thought over time. Homer's account in the Odyssey presented a relatively simple geography focused on the asphodel meadows and the ability of living heroes to communicate with the dead through blood sacrifice. This early version emphasized the underworld's function as a repository for souls, rather than a complex system of rewards and punishments. Virgil's Aeneid, influenced by both Greek tradition and Roman religious concepts, expanded the underworld's geography to include more detailed regions for different categories of souls. His description incorporated elements from mystery religions and philosophical schools that had developed more sophisticated concepts of post-mortem justice and spiritual development. The architectural descriptions in the Aeneid reflected Roman engineering capabilities and aesthetic preferences while maintaining the essential Greek framework. Plato's philosophical writings, particularly the Phaedo and the Republic, presented the underworld as a place where souls underwent purification and education rather than simply existing in shadowy reflection of their former lives. His descriptions emphasized the educational architecture of the underworld, with structures designed to facilitate learning and spiritual development rather than merely providing housing or punishment. The complex geography and administrative structure of the underworld required an extensive network of supernatural beings to maintain order, process the constant influx of souls, and enforce the cosmic laws governing death and the afterlife. These entities ranged from primordial monsters whose origins predated the Olympian gods to specialized servants created specifically for underworld functions. Each possessed unique characteristics and responsibilities that contributed to the realm's efficient operation, while reflecting different aspects of ancient Greek understanding about death, justice, and the supernatural world. Cerberus, the three-headed hound who guarded the gates of Hades, represented the most iconic and formidable of the underworld's guardians. His genealogy traced back to some of the most monstrous beings in Greek mythology, as the offspring of Typhon and Echidna. Typhon, described as a giant with 100 serpent heads who challenged Zeus's authority over the cosmos, represented primordial chaos and destruction. Echidna, known as the mother of monsters, possessed the upper body of a beautiful woman and the lower body of a serpent, combining alluring appearance with deadly nature. This parentage endowed Cerberus with both the raw power necessary to contain the dead and the intelligence required to distinguish between different types of souls and visitors. Ancient descriptions of Cerberus varied considerably in detail and emphasis, but certain characteristics remained consistent across different sources. The beast's 3 heads allowed him to observe all approaches to the underworld simultaneously, with each head possessing its own distinct personality and focus. The central head, typically described as the largest and most authoritative, maintained overall awareness of the Guardian's duties and made final decisions about whom to admit or repel. The left head focused on detecting deception and hidden intentions, its eyes capable of seeing through magical disguises and divine transformations. The right head specialized in identifying the spiritual nature of approaching beings, distinguishing between living mortals, deceased souls, and divine entities. The hound's body, described as being larger than any mortal dog, possessed strength sufficient to restrain even divine beings who attempted unauthorized entry into the underworld. His hide was typically depicted as black or dark bronze in color, with a texture that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. This quality made Cerberus difficult to see clearly in the underworld's shadowy environment, allowing him to appear suddenly before intruders who thought they had found an unguarded approach to the gates. Cerberus's tail took the form of a serpent, complete with its own head and venomous fangs. This additional appendage served both defensive and offensive functions, capable of striking at enemies approaching from behind, while the 3 main heads focused on frontal threats. The serpent tail possessed its own intelligence and could operate independently of the main heads, though it remained subordinate to their collective will. Along the hound's back and neck grew additional serpent heads of varying sizes, creating a writhing mass of fangs and eyes that made close combat with the beast virtually impossible. The symbolic significance of Cerberus's 3 heads has been interpreted in various ways by ancient and modern scholars. Some viewed the Trinity as representing the 3 aspects of time, past, present and future, suggesting that the Guardian could perceive events across temporal boundaries and understand the full implications of allowing or denying passage. Others interpreted the heads as symbolizing the 3 realms of existence, the world of the living, the underworld, and the cosmic void beyond. This interpretation emphasized Cerberus's role as a boundary guardian who maintained the separation between fundamentally different modes of existence. The hound's primary function involved preventing unauthorized movement in both directions across the boundary between life and death. Living mortals who attempted to enter the underworld without divine permission found themselves confronted by a creature whose very presence induced paralyzing terror. Ancient accounts describe how Cerberus's growl could cause earthquakes in the world above, while his bark produced sounds that mortals experienced as the voices of their own deceased relatives calling them toward death. Conversely, Cerberus prevented the dead from escaping the underworld and returning to the world of the living. Souls who attempted to flee their assigned destinations discovered that the Guardian could track them through any part of the underworld, his supernatural senses capable of detecting the spiritual signature of every being who had passed through the gates. The beast's ability to move through the underworld's various regions without being hindered by geographical obstacles or supernatural barriers made escape virtually impossible once he began pursuit. The few successful encounters with Cerberus in Greek mythology revealed specific methods for bypassing or neutralizing the Guardian's defenses. Orpheus, during his attempt to retrieve Eurydice, used his divine musical abilities to lull the beast to sleep. The music's effect on Cerberus demonstrated that the Guardian possessed an aesthetic sensibility that could be appealed to through artistic excellence. The 3 heads reportedly wept upon hearing Orpheus's lament, suggesting that despite his fearsome nature, Cerberus retained capacity for emotional response to genuine grief and love. Heracles' capture of Cerberus during his 12th labour required a different approach, as the hero needed to subdue the beast through physical force rather than magical persuasion. Hades granted permission for the attempt on the condition that Heracles use no weapons, forcing the hero to rely entirely on his superhuman strength and wrestling techniques. The battle between Heracles and Cerberus reportedly lasted for hours, with the hero gradually wearing down the Guardian through persistent grappling while avoiding the venomous bites of the serpent heads. The eventual submission of Cerberus to Heracles represented not defeat, but acknowledgement of the hero's divine nature and legitimate authority to undertake the labour. Charon, the ferryman who transported souls across the rivers of the underworld, occupied a position of crucial importance in the realm's operations, while maintaining a character quite different from the other supernatural beings who served there. Ancient sources described him as an elderly figure with a grizzled beard and eyes that glowed like coals in the underworld's dim light. His appearance suggested great age. Though as an immortal being, he possessed the strength and endurance necessary to pole his ferry continuously across the treacherous waters of the Styx and other underworld rivers. The ferryman's boat, constructed from materials that could withstand the corrosive properties of the underworld's waters, accommodated varying numbers of souls depending on the daily influx of the dead. During times of war, plague, or natural disaster in the mortal world, the vessel could expand to transport hundreds of souls simultaneously. In quieter periods, it contracted to a size appropriate for individual passengers or small groups. The boat's supernatural properties included the ability to navigate the river's changing currents and water levels without requiring conscious steering from Charon, though he maintained control over the vessel's speed and destination. Charon's role extended beyond simple transportation to include preliminary judgment of the souls seeking passage. He possessed the authority to refuse transport to souls who had not received proper burial rites, forcing them to wander the shores of the Styx for 100 years before gaining passage. This requirement reflected the ancient Greek belief that proper funeral rites were essential for the soul's successful transition to the afterlife. Families who failed to provide appropriate burial for their deceased relatives condemned those souls to a century of liminal existence between life and death. The cultural practice of placing coins on the eyes or in the mouths of the deceased originated from the need to pay Charon's fare for crossing the underworld rivers. The specific coin used was typically an obolus, a small silver denomination worth 1/6 of a drachma. The obolus represented a modest but significant expense for most families, ensuring that the payment held genuine value while remaining affordable for all but the poorest members of society. Wealthy families sometimes provided larger denominations, but Charon reportedly accepted only the standard fare, returning excess payment to maintain equality among the dead. The ferryman's insistence on payment served multiple symbolic functions beyond simple economic transaction. The coin represented the final earthly possession that souls carried into death, symbolizing their complete separation from material wealth and worldly concerns. By paying the fare, souls acknowledged their new status as subjects of Hades, rather than citizens of the mortal world. The transaction also established Charon's authority over the crossing, as souls who attempted to board without payment found themselves unable to set foot in the boat. Charon's interactions with living mortals who sought passage to the underworld revealed his role as an enforcer of cosmic law, rather than merely a service provider. When Aeneas approached the ferry during his journey to consult his father's spirit, Charon initially refused passage, recognizing the Trojan hero as a living being who had no right to enter the realm of the dead. Only the intervention of the Sibyl, who presented the golden bough as authorization from the gods, convinced the ferryman to grant passage. This incident demonstrated that even divine heroes required proper authorization to cross the boundary between life and death. The ferryman's knowledge of underworld geography and the souls who had passed through his service made him a valuable source of information for those authorized to seek it. Ancient accounts describe how Charon could recall every soul he had transported and provide details about their origins, manner of death, and assigned destination within the underworld. This encyclopedic knowledge of the dead made him an unofficial chronicler of mortal history, preserving information about individuals and events that might otherwise be forgotten. The Erinyes, known to the Romans as the Furies, represented a different category of underworld inhabitants whose primary function involved pursuing and punishing those who had committed crimes against the natural order, particularly violations of family bonds and sacred oaths. These ancient goddesses predated the Olympian pantheon, having emerged from the blood of Uranus when Cronus castrated his father. This violent origin connected them directly to the primordial forces of justice and retribution that governed the cosmos before the establishment of formal legal systems. 3 Erinyes were traditionally recognized: Alecto, Megaera, and Tisiphone. Each specialized in pursuing different types of offenders, though their areas of responsibility overlapped considerably. Alecto focused on crimes involving anger and moral outrage, pursuing those who had committed acts of violence motivated by rage or hatred. Megaera specialized in cases involving jealousy and envy, tracking down individuals whose crimes stemmed from resentment of others' success or happiness. Tisiphone dealt primarily with murder cases, particularly those involving family members or violations of guest-host relationships. The physical appearance of the Erinyes reflected their function as agents of divine retribution. Ancient sources described them as having bronze wings that allowed them to pursue offenders across any distance, with eyes that wept tears of blood and hair composed of writhing serpents. Their clothing consisted of black robes that seemed to absorb light. making them appear as moving shadows when they travelled through the mortal world. Each carried a whip made from serpents and a torch that burned with cold fire, providing light that revealed hidden crimes while causing pain to those it illuminated. The Erinyes' pursuit of criminals followed specific patterns that reflected ancient Greek concepts of justice and moral responsibility. They typically waited until offenders had enjoyed some period of apparent success or happiness before beginning their persecution, allowing the full weight of divine justice to contrast with temporary earthly rewards. Their torment took both physical and psychological forms, causing nightmares, hallucinations, and gradually increasing physical ailments that eventually drove their victims to madness or death. The transformation of the Erinyes into the Eumenides in Aeschylus's Oresteia trilogy represented a significant development in Greek religious thought about justice and forgiveness. This change reflected the evolution from primitive blood vengeance to formal legal systems that could provide resolution for crimes without perpetuating cycles of retribution. The renamed goddesses retained their power to punish wrongdoing but gained additional authority to bless those who upheld justice and maintained proper relationships with family and community. Hermes Psychopompos occupied a unique position among the Underworld's inhabitants as the only Olympian deity who could freely travel between all realms without requiring special authorization or protection. His role as guide of souls involved escorting the newly dead from the moment of death through their journey to the Underworld and their initial appearance before the judges. This function required him to be present at deaths throughout the mortal world, making him one of the most active and widely travelled of the Olympian gods. The epithet Psychopompos literally meant guide of souls or conductor of souls, reflecting Hermes' responsibility for ensuring that the dead successfully completed their transition from life to afterlife. This role required extensive knowledge of both the pathways between worlds and the proper procedures for presenting souls to the underworld authorities. Hermes' familiarity with these procedures made him an invaluable intermediary for both the dead and the living who sought to communicate across the boundary between life and death. Hermes' equipment for his psychopomp duties included his caduceus, a staff topped with two intertwined serpents that possessed the power to induce sleep in the living and guide the spirits of the dead. The staff's serpents represented the dual nature of his role, as he needed to interact with both the world of the living and the realm of the dead. His winged sandals allowed him to travel instantly between any locations, while his traveller's hat provided protection against the various supernatural hazards encountered during journeys between worlds. The god's interactions with souls during their transition revealed his compassionate nature despite his official duties. Ancient accounts describe how Hermes would comfort frightened souls, explain the procedures they would face in the underworld, and ensure that they understood their rights and options during the judgment process. His presence provided reassurance during what was naturally a terrifying experience for most newly deceased souls. Various other supernatural beings populated the underworld in supporting roles that maintained the realm's complex operations. The Oniroi, or dream spirits, served as messengers between the underworld and the sleeping minds of mortals, carrying communications from the dead to their living relatives. Hypnos and his sons managed the realm's connections to sleep and dreams, ensuring that the boundary between death and sleep remained properly maintained. Thanatos himself occasionally appeared in the underworld to collect souls whose appointed time had arrived, though his duties primarily involved the moment of death rather than the subsequent journey to judgment. The elaborate supernatural bureaucracy that maintained order throughout the underworld culminated in its most crucial function, the judgment of souls and their assignment to appropriate eternal destinations. This process represented far more than simple divine arbitration. It embodied the ancient Greek understanding of moral accountability, cosmic justice, and the relationship between earthly actions and eternal consequences. The system that emerged reflected centuries of evolving religious thought, philosophical speculation, and legal tradition that transformed the relatively egalitarian underworld of Homer's epics into a complex judicial apparatus capable of evaluating the moral worth of every human soul. The three judges who presided over this monumental task, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, brought to their eternal roles the accumulated wisdom and judicial experience they had gained as legendary kings in the mortal world. Their selection for these positions reflected not arbitrary divine appointment, but recognition of their exceptional abilities in governance, lawmaking, and the administration of justice during their earthly reigns. Each had established legal systems and judicial procedures that became models for subsequent civilizations, making their transition to Underworld judges a natural extension of their mortal accomplishments, rather than a completely new assignment. Minos of Crete occupied the position of chief judge, a role that reflected both his reputation as the most accomplished lawgiver of the ancient world and his unique relationship with Zeus, who was his father. During his mortal reign, Minos had transformed Crete into the dominant maritime power of the Mediterranean, establishing legal codes that governed not only his own subjects, but also the various peoples who fell under Cretan influence through trade and conquest. The Minoan legal system, as reconstructed from archaeological evidence and later Greek accounts, emphasized proportional punishment, compensation for victims, and the importance of maintaining social order through consistent application of established laws. The legendary nature of Minos' earthly reign included his periodic consultations with Zeus in a sacred cave on Mount Ida, where father and son would discuss matters of law and governance. These divine consultations provided Minos with insights into cosmic justice that transcended merely human concerns, preparing him for his eventual role in judging souls according to universal rather than culturally specific standards. The wisdom gained through these encounters enabled him to understand the relationship between earthly actions and their cosmic significance, making him uniquely qualified to evaluate the moral weight of human choices. Minos' judicial methodology in the Underworld reflected his earthly experience with complex legal cases involving multiple jurisdictions and conflicting cultural norms. His approach emphasized careful examination of evidence, consideration of circumstances surrounding each soul's actions, and the application of consistent principles rather than arbitrary personal preferences. Ancient sources describe how Minos would spend considerable time reviewing the complete life history of each soul, examining not only specific actions, but also the motivations, circumstances, and consequences that surrounded each significant moral choice. The golden scepter that Minos carried as chief judge possessed supernatural properties that aided in the evaluation process. This artifact, forged by the Cyclops and presented to him by Zeus upon his arrival in the Underworld, could reveal the true nature of any soul's actions by stripping away deception, self-justification, and the distortions that memory and time might have introduced. When Minos raised the scepter while questioning a soul, all pretense fell away, leaving only the essential moral reality of the individual's life choices exposed for examination. Rhadamanthus, brother of Minos and ruler of the eastern regions of the Mediterranean during his mortal life, brought to the judgment process a different but complementary set of skills and perspectives. His earthly kingdom had been characterized by exceptional prosperity and internal harmony, achievements that resulted from his development of legal systems that emphasize prevention of crime through social justice rather than punishment after the fact. The Rhadamanthine approach to governance focused on creating conditions where citizens would naturally choose virtuous behavior rather than requiring constant surveillance and correction. The legal innovations that Rhadamanthus had introduced during his mortal reign included comprehensive social welfare systems, educational programs designed to instill moral values, and economic policies that reduced the desperation and inequality that often drove individuals to criminal behaviour. His courts had been notable for their emphasis on rehabilitation and restoration rather than pure punishment, reflecting his belief that most criminal behaviour resulted from correctable social conditions rather than inherent moral corruption. In the Underworld, Rhadamanthus specialized in judging souls whose moral status was complicated by circumstances beyond their direct control. His expertise in evaluating the relationship between social conditions and individual choices made him particularly effective in cases involving souls who had committed crimes under duress, those whose moral development had been stunted by poverty or ignorance, and individuals whose virtuous intentions had been frustrated by external circumstances. His judgments often reflected sophisticated understanding of how environmental factors influenced moral development while maintaining appropriate standards for personal responsibility. The staff that Rhadamanthus carried bore inscriptions in an ancient script that recorded the fundamental principles of cosmic justice. These principles, according to various ancient sources, included recognition that moral responsibility varied according to knowledge and opportunity, that intentions mattered as much as actions in evaluating moral worth, and that true justice required consideration of both individual circumstances and universal standards. The staff would glow with different colours when applied to souls, indicating the judge's assessment of their moral status and appropriate destination. Aeacus, the third member of the judicial tribunal, had ruled the island of Aegina with such wisdom and justice that Zeus had appointed him to settle disputes among the gods themselves during his mortal lifetime. His reputation for absolute impartiality and incorruptible integrity had made him the preferred arbitrator for conflicts that other judges found too complex or sensitive to resolve. The legal system he established on Aegina became renowned throughout the Greek world for its fairness, efficiency, and ability to maintain social harmony, even during periods of external stress. The particular expertise that Aeacus brought to underworld judgment involved cases where souls had committed crimes against the gods, violated sacred oaths, or broken fundamental taboos that threatened the cosmic order. His experience in mediating disputes between divine beings had given him unique insight into the relationship between mortal actions and their effects on the supernatural realm. This knowledge proved essential in evaluating souls whose earthly behaviour had cosmic implications beyond their immediate human consequences. Aeacus's role also included supervision of the judgment process itself, ensuring that his fellow judges maintained appropriate standards and that the complex bureaucracy of soul processing functioned efficiently. His administrative responsibilities required him to coordinate the activities of various supernatural beings involved in the judgment process, from the initial reception of souls to their final assignment to appropriate destinations. The organisational skills he developed during his mortal reign proved invaluable in managing the enormous volume of souls that arrived daily in the underworld. The bronze key that Aeacus carried symbolised his authority over the underworld's administrative systems and his responsibility for maintaining the integrity of the judgment process. This key could open any door or barrier within the underworld, allowing him to investigate complaints about judicial procedures, inspect the conditions in different regions where souls were assigned, and ensure that the complex system of rewards and punishments functioned according to established cosmic law. The actual process of judgment began when souls arrived at the tribunal after completing their journey across the underworld rivers and through the preliminary processing that determined their basic eligibility for evaluation. The courtroom itself was designed as an amphitheatre carved from black marble, with perfect acoustics that allowed even whispered confessions to be heard clearly by all three judges, while ensuring that their verdicts could be understood by everyone present. The architecture incorporated elements that enhanced the judge's supernatural abilities, including crystalline formations that amplified their perception of spiritual truth and metallic inlays that resonated with the moral vibrations emanating from souls under examination. Each soul appeared before the tribunal individually, though the judges could process multiple cases simultaneously due to their divine nature and the supernatural properties of the courtroom. The examination began with a comprehensive review of the soul's life history, displayed through supernatural means that made every significant action, thought, and choice visible to the judges. This review was not merely chronological, but organised thematically, showing patterns of behaviour, moral development or deterioration over time, and the cumulative effect of the soul's choices on both themselves and others. The questioning that followed this review varied considerably depending on the complexity of each case. Souls whose lives had been clearly virtuous or obviously wicked required minimal examination, as their appropriate destinations were immediately apparent to the judges. However, the vast majority of souls fell into intermediate categories that required careful analysis of competing moral claims, mitigating circumstances, and the relationship between intentions and results. The judges employed various supernatural techniques to ensure accurate evaluation of each soul's moral status. Memory extraction allowed them to access not only the soul's conscious recollections, but also suppressed or forgotten experiences that might be relevant to moral evaluation. Intention analysis revealed the true motivations behind actions that might appear virtuous or wicked on the surface, but actually reflected different moral realities. Consequence tracking showed the full effects of each soul's actions across time, including results that the individual might never have known about during their lifetime. The concept of moral accountability that governed the judgment process reflected sophisticated Greek thinking about the relationship between knowledge, choice, and responsibility. Souls were not held equally accountable for all their actions, but were evaluated according to their understanding of moral principles, their ability to make free choices, and the circumstances that constrained or enabled their behaviour. This approach recognised that moral development was a gradual process, and that individuals' capacity for virtue varied according to their education, social position, and personal experiences. Crimes against the gods received particular attention during the judgment process, as these violations threatened the cosmic order that made civilized existence possible. Hubris, the arrogant defiance of divine authority, was considered especially serious because it represented rejection of the fundamental principles that governed reality itself. Souls guilty of hubris faced punishments designed not only to inflict suffering, but also to demonstrate the futility of challenging cosmic law. The specific punishments varied according to the nature and extent of each soul's defiance, but all emphasized the restoration of proper relationships between mortal and divine realms. Violations of family bonds constituted another category of crime that received severe attention from the judges. The murder of parents, siblings, or children was considered particularly heinous because it violated the natural relationships that form the foundation of human society. Souls guilty of such crimes faced punishments that reflected the cosmic significance of family ties, often involving eternal separation from all forms of companionship, or the constant presence of their victims' spirits demanding justice. Breaches of guest-host relationships, which the Greeks considered sacred obligations protected by Zeus himself, were evaluated with special care due to their importance in maintaining the social networks that enabled trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. Souls who had violated the hospitality code faced punishments that emphasized their exclusion from all forms of community, reflecting their rejection of the reciprocal obligations that made civilization possible. The evolution of underworld judgment from the relatively simple system described in Homer's epics to the complex apparatus found in later sources reflected broader changes in Greek religious and philosophical thought. Homer's underworld was largely egalitarian, with most souls experiencing similar conditions regardless of their earthly behaviour. This early conception reflected a worldview that emphasized fate and divine will, rather than individual moral choice as the primary determinants of human destiny. The development of more sophisticated concepts of personal responsibility and moral accountability led to increasingly complex underworld geography and judgment procedures. The influence of mystery religions, which promised better afterlife conditions for initiates who underwent purification rituals, contributed to the idea that post-mortem destiny could be influenced by earthly choices and spiritual preparation. Philosophical schools, particularly those influenced by Pythagorean and Platonic thought, developed elaborate theories about the soul's nature and its potential for moral development that required correspondingly complex judgment procedures. The role of Dyke, the personification of divine justice, permeated every aspect of the judgment process, ensuring that verdicts reflected universal principles rather than arbitrary divine preferences. Dyke's presence in the Underworld courtroom was manifested through various supernatural phenomena that indicated when justice was being properly administered. The scales of justice would balance perfectly when appropriate verdicts were reached, while atmospheric disturbances or other supernatural signs indicated when the judgment process was being corrupted or misdirected. The judges themselves were subject to Dyke's authority, as their verdicts could be reviewed and corrected by higher cosmic powers if they failed to maintain appropriate standards. This system of checks and balances ensured that the judgment process remained true to its fundamental purpose of maintaining cosmic order rather than becoming a tool for arbitrary divine punishment or favoritism. The accountability of the judges to cosmic justice reflected Greek understanding that even divine authority must be exercised according to universal principles rather than personal preference. The sophisticated judgment apparatus administered by Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus served not merely to categorize souls, but to assign punishments that reflected the cosmic significance of specific transgressions against divine and natural order. The most severe sentences were reserved for individuals whose crimes had disrupted fundamental relationships between mortals and gods, violated sacred obligations, or demonstrated such profound moral corruption that their very existence threatened the stability of cosmic justice. These legendary punishments became paradigmatic examples of divine retribution, serving as both deterrent and instruction for mortals who heard their stories recounted in religious ceremonies, dramatic performances, and philosophical discussions. Tantalus, son of Zeus and king of Sipylus and Lydia, committed crimes so heinous that his punishment became synonymous with eternal frustration and unfulfilled desire. His transgression involved the ultimate violation of guest-host relationships, when he invited the gods to feast at his palace and served them the flesh of his own son Pelops, whom he had murdered and dismembered for the occasion. This act represented multiple layers of cosmic violation. The murder of his child destroyed the natural bonds between parent and offspring that form the foundation of human society. The deception of divine guests violated the sacred obligations of hospitality that Zeus himself protected. And the attempt to make the gods unknowing participants in cannibalism constituted an assault on their divine nature and wisdom. The detection of Tantalus's crime revealed the impossibility of deceiving divine perception. The gods immediately recognized the nature of the meal set before them, with only Demeter, distracted by grief over her daughter Persephone's abduction, accidentally consuming a portion of Pelops' shoulder before realizing the horror of what had been served. The gods' response was swift and comprehensive. They restored Pelops to life, replacing his missing shoulder with one crafted from ivory, and condemned Tantalus to a punishment that would reflect the eternal consequences of his violation of fundamental cosmic principles. The specific torment devised for Tantalus demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the relationship between crime and appropriate retribution. He was placed in a pool of clear water that reached his chin beneath branches heavy with ripe fruit that hung just above his head. When he bent down to drink, the water would recede, leaving only dry earth beneath his lips. When he reached up to grasp the fruit, the branches would lift just beyond his reach, leaving him grasping empty air. This punishment created a state of eternal anticipation and frustration that reflected his attempt to satisfy his own twisted desires at the expense of natural and divine law. The psychological dimensions of Tantalus's punishment extended beyond simple physical discomfort to encompass the eternal contemplation of his crime and its consequences. The pool in which he stood reflected not only his physical form, but also images of his son Pelops, reminding him constantly of the child he had murdered. The fruit above his head would occasionally take on the appearance of delicacies from the feast where he had committed his crime, forcing him to relive the moment of his transgression while experiencing the eternal consequences of his choices. The chamber that contained Tantalus's punishment was constructed from materials that amplified both his physical suffering and his psychological torment. The walls were lined with bronze mirrors that reflected his image from multiple angles, ensuring that he could never escape visual reminders of his degraded state. The acoustic properties of the space meant that every sound he made, his gasps of thirst, his groans of hunger, his cries of frustration, echoed endlessly around him, creating a constant auditory reminder of his punishment. The temperature remained perpetually at the point where thirst and hunger would be most acutely felt, neither hot enough to bring quick dehydration nor cool enough to provide any relief from his cravings. Ancient sources emphasized that Tantalus's punishment was designed to be eternal and inescapable. The water and fruit were not mere illusions, but genuine substances that possessed supernatural properties, preventing his access to them. The water was drawn from the Styx itself, making it sacred and therefore impossible for him to obtain through any deception or force. The fruit grew from branches of trees sacred to various gods, placing them under divine protection that no amount of desperate effort could overcome. This supernatural reinforcement of his punishment ensured that no clever stratagem or eventual adaptation could provide relief from his torment. The broader implications of Tantalus's punishment extended beyond individual retribution to encompass cosmic instruction about the nature of desire, satisfaction, and the proper relationships between mortals and gods. His eternal hunger and thirst represented the logical conclusion of appetites that recognized no moral boundaries, demonstrating how unchecked desire ultimately defeated itself by making satisfaction impossible. The punishment illustrated that violations of fundamental cosmic principles created conditions where the violator's own nature became the instrument of their torment. Sisyphus, king of Corinth and son of Aeolus, earned his eternal punishment through a pattern of deception and defiance that challenged the authority of multiple gods while demonstrating contempt for the natural order governing life and death. His crimes began with relatively minor acts of cunning and escalated to direct confrontation with divine authority, culminating in his attempt to cheat death itself through elaborate schemes that revealed both remarkable intelligence and profound moral corruption. The initial transgression that brought Sisyphus to divine attention involved his betrayal of Zeus's secret affair with the river nymph Aegina. When the river god Asopus came searching for his missing daughter, Sisyphus revealed Zeus's involvement in exchange for a spring of fresh water for his city. This act violated the implicit understanding that mortals should not interfere in divine affairs, particularly those involving Zeus's romantic entanglements. The information Sisyphus provided enabled Asopus to track down Zeus and Aegina, creating a confrontation that Zeus resolved only through the use of his thunderbolts to drive away the angry father. Zeus's response to this betrayal involved sending Thanatos to collect Sisyphus's soul, but the cunning king had anticipated divine retribution and prepared an elaborate trap for the personification of death itself. When Thanatos arrived to escort Sisyphus to the Underworld, the king expressed curiosity about how the chains that bound souls to their fate actually functioned. Demonstrating these chains to satisfy Sisyphus's apparent scholarly interest, Thanatos found himself trapped by mechanisms the king had secretly prepared, leaving death itself imprisoned and unable to perform his cosmic function. The consequences of Thanatos' captivity created chaos throughout the mortal world, as no one could die regardless of their injuries or illnesses. Warriors continued fighting with mortal wounds that should have killed them instantly, while the elderly and sick lingered in states of suffering that natural death would normally have ended. Ares, the god of war, found his domain particularly affected, as battles lost their decisive character when combatants could not be killed. The war god's complaints to Zeus about this disruption of natural order prompted divine intervention to free Thanatos and restore the proper functioning of death. Hermes was dispatched to free Thanatos and bring Sisyphus to the underworld for judgment, but the king's cunning extended to preparations for this eventuality as well. Before his capture, Sisyphus had instructed his wife Merope not to perform the proper funeral rites for his body, knowing that this violation of religious custom would provide grounds for appeal once he reached the underworld. When he appeared before the judges of the dead, Sisyphus argued that he could not be properly processed until his burial had been completed, according to established religious requirements. The technical accuracy of this argument created a bureaucratic dilemma for the underworld authorities. The established procedures for handling souls did require proper funeral rites as a prerequisite for final judgment and assignment to eternal destinations. Sisyphus's manipulation of these requirements forced Hades to grant him temporary release to return to the world of the living and ensure that his funeral was properly conducted. This decision reflected the underworld's commitment to following established procedures, even when dealing with souls who attempted to exploit technicalities for their own benefit. Sisyphus's return to life provided him with the opportunity to extend his deception further. Rather than arranging for his proper burial and returning to the underworld as agreed, he simply resumed his mortal existence, enjoying additional years of life while the underworld authorities dealt with the legal complications his case had created. His flouting of the agreement he'd made with Hades constituted a direct challenge to the cosmic order and the reliability of divine justice, making his eventual punishment a matter of fundamental importance for maintaining the credibility of underworld authority. The eventual recapture of Sisyphus required direct intervention by Hermes, who transported the king to the underworld without the possibility of further legal maneuvering. The judgment that followed took into account not only his original crimes, but also his repeated attempts to cheat death and his violation of agreements made with divine authorities. The cumulative effect of these transgressions demanded a punishment that would reflect both the cleverness he had displayed and the futility of attempting to outwit cosmic justice. The punishment devised for Sisyphus involved rolling a massive boulder up a steep hill for eternity, with the stone always rolling back down just before reaching the summit. This task was designed to exploit Sisyphus's own nature against him, as his intelligence and determination, which had enabled his elaborate schemes against the gods, now became the very qualities that ensured his eternal torment. The punishment required constant effort and attention, preventing him from developing new plans for escape while demonstrating the ultimate futility of his rebellion against divine authority. The boulder itself was crafted from materials that made it impossible for Sisyphus to abandon his task or find alternative solutions to his predicament. Its weight was precisely calibrated to require his full strength and concentration to move, while its surface provided just enough grip to make progress possible but insufficient to prevent its inevitable return to the bottom of the hill. The stone's supernatural properties included the ability to increase in weight if Sisyphus attempted to rest or reduce his effort, ensuring that only maximum exertion could achieve any progress at all. The hill up which Sisyphus pushed his boulder was constructed with a slope that became progressively steeper as it approached the summit, requiring increasingly greater effort for each increment of progress. The path was wide enough to prevent the stone from rolling off to either side, but narrow enough that Sisyphus could not attempt to find easier routes to the top. The surface was perfectly smooth, providing no irregularities that might catch the boulder and provide temporary rest, while the grade was calculated to ensure that the stone would always roll backward if forward pressure was not maintained. The psychological aspects of Sisyphus's punishment proved as tormenting as the physical demands of his task. Each attempt to reach the summit was accompanied by hope that this time he might succeed, followed by the crushing disappointment of watching his progress destroyed as the boulder rolled back to its starting position. The eternal repetition of this cycle created a form of torment that combined physical exhaustion with psychological frustration, demonstrating how hope itself could become an instrument of punishment when it was perpetually frustrated. Ancient philosophical interpretations of Sisyphus's punishment focused on its representation of the human condition and the relationship between effort and achievement. Some viewed the eternal task as a metaphor for the futility of human ambition when it was not aligned with cosmic order, while others saw it as demonstrating the dignity that could be found in persistent effort even when ultimate success was impossible. The punishment's emphasis on repetitive action without final resolution reflected broader questions about the meaning and purpose of human existence in a universe governed by forces beyond mortal comprehension. Ixion, king of the Lapiths and son of Ares, earned his place among the great sinners through crimes that violated both divine hospitality and the sacred bonds of marriage, culminating in an assault on Hera herself that represented the ultimate transgression against the cosmic order. His punishment, binding to a fiery wheel that spun eternally through the underworld, reflected the rotating nature of his crimes and the burning shame that his actions had brought upon both himself and the natural relationships he had violated. The sequence of crimes that led to Ixion's eternal punishment began with the murder of his father-in-law, Ioneus, whom he killed to avoid paying the bride price agreed upon for his marriage to Dia. This act violated multiple layers of cosmic law. The murder itself disrupted the natural order that protected family relationships. The deception involved in the marriage agreement violated the trust that made social contracts possible, and the specific targeting of a relative through marriage destroyed the extended kinship networks that form the foundation of civilized society. The pollution created by Ixion's crime was so severe that no mortal authority could provide purification, leaving him as an outcast who wandered from city to city seeking cleansing that no human priest or king could offer. This situation created a crisis that required divine intervention, as the cosmic balance had been disrupted by a crime that exceeded the capacity of mortal justice systems to address. Zeus himself eventually provided purification for Ixion, not out of approval for his actions, but because the pollution he carried threatened to contaminate everything he encountered. Zeus's act of purification included an invitation for Ixion to join the gods at their feasts on Mount Olympus, representing an extraordinary act of divine mercy that offered the criminal an opportunity for redemption through proper behaviour in divine company. This invitation reflected the gods' understanding that even severe transgressions could potentially be overcome through genuine repentance and reformed conduct. The hospitality extended to Ixion was particularly significant because it demonstrated divine willingness to overlook past crimes in favour of future virtue. Ixion's response to this divine generosity revealed the depth of his moral corruption and his inability to learn from his previous mistakes. Rather than showing gratitude for Zeus's mercy and attempting to reform his behaviour, he became infatuated with Hera and began plotting to seduce the Queen of the Gods. This plan represented not only ingratitude toward his divine host, but also a direct assault on the marriage bonds that form the foundation of divine and mortal society. The attempt to seduce Hera constituted hubris of the most extreme kind, as it challenged Zeus's authority in the most personal and fundamental way possible. Zeus's discovery of Ixion's intentions led to an elaborate test designed to determine the full extent of his guest's treachery. The king of the gods created a cloud in Hera's exact likeness, endowing it with her appearance and apparent substance while ensuring that it lacked her divine essence and consciousness. This cloud Hera, known as Nephele, was placed in situations where Ixion would encounter her, providing him with opportunities to reveal his true intentions through his actions, rather than merely his thoughts. Ixion's seduction of Nephele, believing her to be the real Hera, completed his transformation from a king seeking purification into a criminal whose crimes threatened the very foundations of cosmic order. His coupling with the Cloud Woman produced offspring in the form of Centaurus, the ancestor of the centaurs, whose hybrid nature reflected the monstrous character of the union that had created him. The birth of these creatures served as a permanent reminder of Ixion's crime and its consequences for the natural world. The punishment devised for Ixion reflected both the rotating nature of his deceptions and the burning shame that his actions had created. He was bound with serpents to a wheel of fire that spun continuously through the underworld, creating a visual representation of the cyclical nature of his crimes and their consequences. The wheel's rotation ensured that he experienced his punishment from every possible angle, while the fire that composed it burned without consuming, creating eternal torment without the release that destruction might have provided. The fiery wheel to which Ixion was bound possessed supernatural properties that made his punishment inescapable and eternally renewable. The flames that formed the wheel's structure burned with divine fire that could not be extinguished by any natural or supernatural means, while the serpents that bound him to the wheel were offspring of the Erinyes, making them instruments of cosmic justice rather than mere restraints. The wheel's rotation was powered by the cosmic forces that maintained universal order, ensuring that it would continue spinning as long as the universe itself existed. The Danaides, the 50 daughters of Danaus who murdered their husbands on their wedding night, received a punishment that reflected both the magnitude of their crime and the specific nature of their violation of marriage bonds. Their eternal task of filling leaking vessels with water from the underworld rivers created a futile cycle of labour that demonstrated the impossibility of washing away the pollution created by their coordinated assault on the sacred institution of marriage. The crime committed by the Danaides originated in a dynastic conflict between their father Danaus and his brother Aegyptus, who ruled Egypt while Danaus controlled Libya. Aegyptus proposed that his 50 sons marry Danaus's 50 daughters as a means of uniting their kingdoms and ending the rivalry between the brothers. Danaus, however, suspected that this marriage alliance was actually a plot by Aegyptus to eliminate him and seize control of both kingdoms through his sons' marriages to the Danaides. Danaus's response to his brother's proposal involved fleeing with his daughters to Argos, where he sought protection from the local king and established himself as a ruler through various political manoeuvrings. However, Aegyptus's sons pursued them to Greece and renewed their demand for the promised marriages, threatening war if their suits were rejected. Faced with superior military force, Danaus agreed to the marriages but secretly instructed his daughters to murder their husbands on their wedding night, providing each with a sharp pin or dagger for the purpose. 49 of the Danaides obeyed their father's instructions, killing their husbands as they slept after the wedding festivities. Only Hypermnestra refused to commit murder, sparing her husband Lynceus because he had respected her virginity and treated her with kindness during their brief marriage. Her decision to preserve her husband's life created a precedent for mercy and forgiveness that contrasted sharply with her sister's obedience to their father's murderous commands. The mass murder of the 49 bridegrooms created pollution on an unprecedented scale, as it violated not only the natural bonds between husbands and wives, but also the sacred obligations of hospitality that protected guests and the cosmic order that governed the transition from maidenhood to married life. The coordinated nature of the crime made it particularly heinous, as it demonstrated premeditation and collective action in service of a plan that destroyed the trust necessary for social relationships to function. The punishment assigned to the 49 murderous Danaides involved carrying water in vessels with holes in their bottoms, attempting to fill a large basin that could never be completed due to the constant leakage. This task reflected the impossibility of washing away the blood guilt they had incurred through their crime, as the water they carried represented purification that could never be achieved through mechanical effort alone. The leaking vessels symbolized their damaged souls, which could not retain the cleansing they sought because the fundamental corruption of their nature prevented genuine purification. The water that the Danaides attempted to carry came from the river Lethe, whose properties normally provided forgetfulness and release from memory's burdens. However, Their crime was so severe that even the waters of forgetfulness could not cleanse them, demonstrating that some transgressions created permanent alterations in the soul's nature that could not be undone through any external means. The irony of their punishment lay in their desperate desire for the very forgetfulness that the water they carried was supposed to provide, yet their inability to retain it made their torment eternal. Tityos, a giant who attempted to assault Leto, mother of Apollo and Artemis, received a punishment that reflected both the physical nature of his crime and the regenerative aspects of divine justice. His eternal torment involved having his liver devoured by vultures or eagles, with the organ regenerating each day so that the process could be repeated indefinitely. This punishment demonstrated how crimes against the mothers of gods carried consequences that extended beyond simple retribution to encompass the restoration of cosmic balance through perpetual suffering. The specific nature of Tityos's punishment reflected ancient understanding of the liver as the seat of passion and desire, making its destruction and regeneration a fitting consequence for crimes motivated by uncontrolled lust. The birds that performed this eternal task were sacred to Zeus, making their participation in the punishment a direct expression of divine justice rather than mere natural predation. The daily cycle of destruction and renewal created a rhythm of suffering that matched the cyclical nature of the cosmic order that Tityos had violated through his assault on Leto. The eternal punishments administered to cosmic criminals like Tantalus, Sisyphus, and Ixion served as both deterrent and instruction, but they also established the underworld as a realm that could be entered by the living under extraordinary circumstances. The concept of katabasis, the descent of a living person into the underworld, represented one of the most challenging and dangerous undertakings in Greek mythology, requiring not only exceptional courage but also divine favour, supernatural protection, or extraordinary abilities that could overcome the natural barriers separating life from death. These heroic journeys into Hades' domain reveal the underworld's geography, customs, and inhabitants, while demonstrating the profound transformation that such experiences wrought upon those who survived them. Odysseus's Nekyia, described in Book 12 of Homer's Odyssey, established the foundational pattern for heroic consultation with the dead, while revealing crucial details about the underworld's nature and the conditions of souls dwelling there. The hero's journey to the entrance of Hades' realm occurred not as a physical descent, but as a ritual summoning performed at the edge of the world, where the boundaries between life and death became permeable under specific ceremonial conditions. This approach reflected early Greek understanding of death as a state that could be temporarily bridged through proper religious observance, rather than requiring actual entry into the underworld's physical geography. The location chosen for Odysseus's ritual consultation held profound significance in ancient Greek cosmology. Circe directed him to sail to the limits of the ocean, where the rivers Pyriphlegethon and Cocytus flowed into the Acheron, creating a confluence of underworld waters that weakened the barriers between realms. This geographical specificity reflected sophisticated understanding of how cosmic geography influenced supernatural phenomena, with certain locations serving as natural gateways where communication between different planes of existence became possible. The ritual requirements for the Nekyia demonstrated the complex relationship between blood sacrifice, divine authority, and the animation of souls. Odysseus was instructed to dig a cubit-square pit and pour libations of honey mixed with milk, wine and water, followed by a sprinkling of white barley. These offerings acknowledged different aspects of underworld authority, while providing the substances necessary to give temporary form and voice to the incorporeal dead. The specific measurements and materials required reflected centuries of religious tradition that had determined the precise conditions under which such communication could occur. The blood sacrifice that formed the centerpiece of the ritual involved the slaughter of a black ram and a black ewe, animals whose color connected them to the darkness of the underworld, while their gender pairing represented the completeness necessary for effective supernatural communication. the blood that flowed into the pit served as a temporary source of vitality for the souls, allowing them to assume sufficient corporeal form to speak and interact with the living hero. The choice of sheep for this sacrifice reflected their traditional association with pastoral life and their symbolic connection to guidance and protection. The arrival of souls at Odysseus's ritual site revealed the hierarchical nature of the underworld population and the different conditions experienced by various categories of the dead. The first to appear were the souls of Odysseus's recently deceased companions, led by Elpenor, whose body remained unburied on Circe's island. Elpenor's ability to speak without drinking blood demonstrated that souls of the recently dead retained more vitality than those who had been in the underworld for extended periods, while his urgent request for proper burial emphasized the continued importance of funeral rites for the dead's well-being. The appearance of Odysseus's mother, Anticlea, provided crucial information about the physical nature of souls in the underworld. When the hero attempted to embrace her shade, his arms passed through her form like smoke or shadow, revealing that the dead retained the appearance and personality of their living selves while losing the substantial reality that characterized mortal existence. This encounter established the fundamental distinction between the living and the dead as one of substance rather than consciousness, with souls maintaining their identity and memories while existing in an attenuated form that could interact with the physical world only under special circumstances. The prophet Tiresias, whose supernatural abilities had persisted beyond death, served as Odysseus's primary source of information about both his future destiny and the nature of the underworld itself. The seer's retention of his prophetic powers demonstrated that exceptional spiritual abilities could transcend the normal limitations imposed by death, though even he required blood sacrifice to achieve sufficient vitality for extended communication. Tiresias's prophecies regarding Odysseus's journey home revealed how the underworld served as a repository of knowledge about past, present and future events, with the dead possessing perspectives unavailable to the living. The parade of heroic women who appeared to drink blood and share their stories with Odysseus provided a comprehensive catalogue of legendary figures, while revealing how death had affected their various destinies. These encounters demonstrated that social status, beauty and earthly achievements held little relevance in the underworld, where all souls existed in similar conditions regardless of their mortal circumstances. The stories they told emphasized how their lives had been shaped by relationships with gods and heroes, suggesting that such connections provided the primary means by which mortals could achieve lasting significance beyond death. The appearance of Agamemnon's shade offered crucial insights into the social dynamics that persisted among the dead, as the former king retained both his royal dignity and his bitter resentment over the circumstances of his murder. His detailed account of his death at the hands of Aegisthus and Clytemnestra revealed how the dead remained aware of events in the world above, particularly those involving their own families and the consequences of their earthly actions. Agamemnon's warnings about the treachery of women reflected both his personal trauma and the broader cultural anxieties about gender relations that characterized archaic Greek society. Achilles' famous declaration that he would rather be a landless labourer among the living than rule over all the dead established one of the most influential statements about the relative value of life and death in Greek literature. This sentiment contradicted earlier heroic values that emphasized glory and honor over a mere survival, suggesting that even the greatest heroes found existence in the underworld unsatisfying compared to mortal life. The conversation between Achilles and Odysseus revealed how death had altered the hero's perspective on the warrior values that had defined his living identity. The encounter with Ajax, son of Telamon, demonstrated how personal grievances and wounded pride could persist beyond death, creating eternal sources of conflict among the Shades. Ajax's refusal to speak with Odysseus reflected his continued resentment over losing the contest for Achilles' armour, showing that the competitive dynamics that characterized heroic society continued to influence relationships in the underworld. This interaction emphasized how death did not automatically resolve the conflicts and tensions that had marked these heroes' mortal lives. Odysseus's glimpse of the great sinners being punished in Tartarus, Tantalus, Sisyphus and Tityos provided visual confirmation of the justice system operating in the underworld's deeper regions. These brief descriptions established the connection between extraordinary crimes and eternal punishment, while demonstrating that the underworld contained multiple regions with different conditions for different categories of souls. The hero's observation of these punishments served as both entertainment and moral instruction, showing the ultimate consequences of transgressing divine law. The ritual's conclusion, when the gathering souls became too numerous and threatening for Odysseus to control, revealed the dangers inherent in communication with the dead. The hero's decision to retreat to his ship before the situation became unmanageable demonstrated the importance of maintaining proper boundaries between the living and the dead, as prolonged contact could potentially draw the living into the realm of death. This episode established precedent for the careful limitations that needed to govern any interaction between mortals and the underworld's inhabitants. Orpheus's descent to retrieve his beloved Eurydice represented a fundamentally different type of catabasis, driven by love rather than the need for information or the completion of assigned tasks. The musician's journey into the underworld demonstrated how exceptional artistic ability could serve as a form of divine power capable of moving even the rulers of the dead, while also revealing the tragic limitations that governed any attempt to reverse the natural order of life and death. The circumstances leading to Eurydice's death established the random, tragic nature of mortality that motivated Orpheus's unprecedented attempt to reclaim his bride from death itself. The young woman's fatal encounter with a snake while fleeing the unwanted advances of Aristaeus occurred on her wedding day, making her death particularly poignant as it destroyed the couple's happiness at the moment of its greatest fulfillment. The timing of this tragedy emphasized how death could strike without warning or apparent justice, creating situations that seemed to demand heroic intervention. Orpheus's decision to descend personally into the underworld, rather than accepting his loss, reflected both his extraordinary devotion to Eurydice and his confidence in his musical abilities to accomplish what no other mortal had attempted. His preparation for the journey involved not military equipment or magical protection, but only his lyre, demonstrating his belief that artistic excellence could succeed where force or cunning might fail. This approach represented a unique strategy for dealing with underworld authorities, appealing to aesthetic sensibility rather than attempting to circumvent or overpower the realm's guardians. The musician's passage through the underworld's various obstacles revealed how his divine musical gift affected different categories of supernatural beings. Charon, normally inflexible in his requirements for passage across the Styx, was moved by Orpheus's lament to transport the living hero without payment or authorization. The ferryman's unprecedented cooperation demonstrated how genuine artistic expression could transcend normal bureaucratic procedures, creating exceptions to established rules through emotional rather than legal appeal. Cerberus's response to Orpheus's music provided the most dramatic example of how artistic beauty could overcome even the most formidable supernatural guardians. The three-headed hound, whose primary function involved preventing unauthorized entry into the underworld, was lulled to sleep by the musician's performance, allowing Orpheus to pass unhindered through the gates of Hades. Ancient sources described how all three heads were affected simultaneously, with the beast's serpentine mane lying still and his eyes closing in peaceful slumber for the first time since his appointment as guardian. The effect of Orpheus's music on the various inhabitants of the underworld revealed the universal power of artistic beauty to transcend the normal conditions governing existence in the realm of the dead. The tormented souls in Tartarus found temporary relief from their punishments as they listened to the musician's lament, with Tantalus forgetting his eternal thirst and Sisyphus pausing in his labour to attend to the unprecedented sound of living music in the land of the dead. Even the Erinyes, whose nature compelled them to pursue vengeance without mercy, were moved to tears by the beauty and sincerity of Orpheus's performance. The appearance of Orpheus before Hades and Persephone created an unprecedented situation in underworld administration, as no living mortal had ever before approached the throne room of the underworld's rulers with a request for the return of a soul. The musician's performance of his lament for Eurydice demonstrated how artistic expression could serve as a form of prayer or petition, with the emotional content of his music conveying his grief and love more effectively than any spoken argument could have achieved. Hades' response to Orpheus's musical petition revealed the Lord of the Dead's capacity for compassion, despite his reputation for inflexibility regarding the natural order. The god's decision to grant the unprecedented request reflected not weakness or sentimentality, but recognition that Orpheus's love for Eurydice represented the kind of extraordinary devotion that deserved exceptional consideration. Persephone's support for the petition emphasized her own understanding of love and loss, as her experience of being separated from her mother Demeter gave her particular sympathy for those suffering from enforced separation. The conditions attached to Eurydice's release demonstrated the careful balance between mercy and cosmic order that governed even exceptional decisions by underworld authorities. Orpheus was permitted to lead his wife back to the world of the living, but only on the condition that he not look back at her until they had both emerged completely from the underworld's domain. This requirement reflected the fundamental principle that trust and faith were necessary components of any attempt to transcend natural limitations, while also ensuring that the normal barriers between life and death would be respected even in cases where exceptions were granted. The tragic failure of Orpheus's mission, when he turned to look at Eurydice just before reaching the surface world, revealed the profound difficulty of maintaining absolute faith when dealing with matters that transcended normal human experience. The musician's momentary doubt, whether motivated by concern for his wife's well-being or simple human weakness, resulted in her immediate return to the underworld and the permanent loss of any opportunity for reunion. This outcome demonstrated that even divine favour and exceptional circumstances could not overcome the fundamental requirements for transcending natural law. Heracles' capture of Cerberus during his 12th labour represented the most successful physical intrusion into the underworld by a living hero, accomplished through a combination of divine authorization, exceptional strength, and careful adherence to the conditions established by underworld authorities. This labour differed from other heroic descents in that it involved not consultation with the dead or the rescue of a loved one, but the removal of one of the underworld's most important guardians as proof of the hero's extraordinary capabilities. The assignment of this labour by King Eurystheus reflected both the ruler's desire to eliminate Heracles through an impossible task, and his understanding that the capture of Cerberus would require the hero to overcome challenges that had defeated every previous attempt. The specific choice of Cerberus as the target emphasized the labour's function as a test of Heracles' ability to succeed where other heroes had failed, while also requiring him to demonstrate respect for underworld authority rather than simply overpowering his opposition through brute force. Heracles' preparation for the descent involved initiation into the Eleusinian mysteries, religious rites that provided participants with knowledge about the underworld and protection during journeys between life and death. This spiritual preparation demonstrated that even heroes of exceptional physical prowess required religious purification and divine favour to survive extended contact with the realm of the dead. The specific choice of Eleusinian initiation reflected the mystery's reputation for providing the most effective preparation for underworld journeys. The hero's entry into the underworld through the cave at Cape Tanarum followed established precedent for heroic descents, while demonstrating his respect for traditional approaches to crossing the boundary between realms. His companion Hermes served both as guide and as divine authorization for the unprecedented mission, ensuring that underworld authorities would recognize the legitimacy of his presence. The Psychopomp's participation emphasized the importance of proper divine sponsorship for any attempt to enter the realm of the dead. Heracles' encounters with various underworld inhabitants during his journey to Hades' palace revealed how his heroic status affected different categories of supernatural beings. The ordinary shades fled from his presence, recognizing in him a vitality and power that marked him as fundamentally different from themselves. This reaction demonstrated how the living presence of an exceptional hero could disturb the normal conditions of existence in the underworld, creating a form of supernatural disruption that required careful management by the realm's authorities. The negotiation between Heracles and Hades for permission to capture Cerberus established important precedents for the interaction between heroic authority and underworld law. Hades' willingness to grant the request reflected his recognition of Heracles' divine parentage and his status as Zeus's son, while the conditions he imposed demonstrated that even divine heroes must show respect for the cosmic order governing the separation between life and death. The requirement that Heracles use no weapons in subduing Cerberus emphasized the importance of achieving victory through personal excellence rather than external advantages. The battle between Heracles and Cerberus represented one of the most physically demanding challenges the hero faced during his 12 labours, requiring him to overcome a supernatural guardian whose strength and ferocity had been specifically designed to prevent exactly such attempts. The hero's success in wrestling the three-headed hound into submission demonstrated not only his exceptional physical capabilities, but also his ability to maintain focus and determination when facing opponents whose nature transcended normal mortal experience. Theseus and Pirithous' failed attempt to kidnap Persephone reveal the catastrophic consequences that could result when heroic ambition exceeded the bounds of cosmic propriety, transforming what began as a daring adventure into a cautionary tale about the limits of mortal presumption. Their joint descent into the underworld represented the most audacious violation of underworld sovereignty attempted by living heroes, motivated not by noble purposes like love or duty, but by the arrogant desire to possess what belonged rightfully to the gods. The audacious failure of Theseus and Pirithous to abduct Persephone marked more than just the limits of heroic presumption. It signalled the beginning of a fundamental transformation in Greek religious thought about death and the afterlife. While traditional mythology emphasized the finality of death and the shadowy existence that awaited all souls regardless of their earthly conduct, a new category of religious experience emerged that promised initiates a radically different fate in the underworld. These mystery religions offered secret knowledge, ritual purification, and the promise of blessed afterlife conditions that stood in stark contrast to the egalitarian gloom of Homer's underworld. The Eleusinian mysteries represented the most prestigious and influential of these secret religious traditions, drawing initiates from across the Mediterranean world to participate in rites that promised transformation of their post-mortem destiny. Located at Eleusis, approximately 14 miles northwest of Athens, the sanctuary complex grew from a modest local cult into an international religious centre whose influence shaped Greek attitudes toward death for over a millennium. The mysteries centred on the myth of Demeter and Persephone, but their ritual interpretation of this story offered initiates something far more profound than simple mythological instruction. The origins of the Eleusinian cult traced back to the Bronze Age, with archaeological evidence suggesting continuous religious activity at the site from at least the 15th century BC. The early cult focused on Demeter's role as a grain goddess, with local farmers seeking her blessing for successful harvests through seasonal festivals and agricultural rituals. The incorporation of Persephone's underworld journey into these agricultural observances created a theological framework that connected the cycles of plant growth and decay with human death and potential rebirth. The transformation of local agricultural festivals into mystery religions occurred gradually over several centuries, influenced by contact with Near Eastern religious traditions that emphasized individual salvation and secret knowledge. The concept of mystery religions, cults that promised special benefits to initiates who underwent secret rituals, represented a significant departure from traditional Greek religious practice, which typically involved public ceremonies that reinforce community solidarity rather than individual spiritual transformation. The physical layout of the Eleusinian sanctuary reflected the mystery's emphasis on progressive revelation and hierarchical initiation. The complex included multiple buildings designed for different stages of the ritual process, with the most sacred spaces accessible only to those who had completed specific preparatory requirements. The telesterion, the great hall where the central mystery rites were performed, could accommodate thousands of initiates simultaneously while maintaining the secrecy essential to the mystery's religious effectiveness. The telesterion's architectural design incorporated features that enhanced the psychological impact of the ritual revelations performed within its walls. The building's interior was arranged as a series of terraced platforms that allowed initiates to observe the central ceremonies while creating a sense of ascending toward divine truth. The roof incorporated openings that permitted controlled illumination of specific areas during different phases of the ritual, with dramatic lighting effects that reinforced the theological content of the ceremonies being performed. The initiation process at Eleusis involved multiple stages spread across an entire year, with each phase building upon previous revelations, while preparing participants for increasingly profound spiritual experiences. The preliminary initiation, known as the Lesser Mysteries, took place in Athens during the spring and involved purification rituals, fasting, and instruction in the basic theological principles underlying the cult. These preparatory rites served to identify serious candidates while weeding out those whose commitment to the mysteries was superficial or whose motivations were inappropriate. The Greater Mysteries, held annually in September, represented the culmination of the initiation process and the occasion when the most sacred revelations were shared with qualified participants. The festival began with a procession from Athens to Eleusis that recreated Demeter's search for her abducted daughter, with initiates carrying sacred objects and participating in ritual activities that prepared them psychologically for the transformative experiences awaiting them at the sanctuary. The secrecy surrounding the central Eleusinian rituals was maintained with extraordinary effectiveness throughout the mystery's thousand-year history, with initiates bound by religious oaths that threatened divine punishment for any revelation of the sacred knowledge they had received. This secrecy was not merely a matter of exclusivity, but reflected genuine belief that premature or inappropriate exposure to the mystery's revelations could cause spiritual harm to unprepared individuals, while diminishing the religious effectiveness of the rites themselves. The few hints about the mystery's content that survive in ancient sources suggest that the central revelation involved a dramatic reenactment of Persephone's return from the Underworld, presented in ways that demonstrated the possibility of triumph over death for properly prepared initiates. The ritual apparently included the display of sacred objects whose symbolic significance conveyed theological truths about the soul's nature and its potential for post-mortem transformation. The emotional impact of these revelations was reportedly so profound that many initiates described the experience as a form of spiritual rebirth that fundamentally altered their understanding of life and death. The theological promise offered by Eleusinian initiation involved not the elimination of death, but the transformation of the initiate's experience in the underworld. Rather than joining the shadowy masses in the asphodel meadows, mystery initiates were promised residence in the Elysian fields, where they would enjoy conditions of perpetual happiness and fulfillment. This promise represented a revolutionary development in Greek religious thought, as it made post-mortem destiny dependent upon earthly spiritual preparation rather than birth, heroic achievement, or divine favoritism. The social implications of the Eleusinian promise were carefully managed to avoid creating excessive disruption to traditional religious and political structures. The mysteries welcomed initiates from all social classes and both genders, but the expense and time required for proper participation meant that most initiates came from relatively prosperous backgrounds. The cult's emphasis on spiritual equality among initiates coexisted with continued recognition of social hierarchies in other contexts, allowing the mysteries to offer religious innovation without challenging fundamental political arrangements. The influence of Eleusinian theology extended far beyond the specific cult site, affecting broader Greek attitudes toward death and creating pressure for other religious traditions to develop their own promises of post-mortem benefits. The success of the mysteries demonstrated that significant numbers of Greeks were dissatisfied with traditional concepts of the afterlife and were willing to invest considerable resources in religious practices that promised better conditions after death. Orphic religious traditions represented a different approach to transforming post-mortem destiny, emphasizing individual purification and the acquisition of secret knowledge that would enable souls to navigate the underworld successfully and achieve eventual liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth. Unlike the Eleusinian mysteries, which centered on specific sanctuary sites and required formal initiation ceremonies, Orphic beliefs spread through texts, oral teachings, and individual religious practices that could be adopted without institutional affiliation. The mythological foundation of Orphic religion drew upon the story of Orpheus's descent to retrieve Eurydice, but Orphic theologians developed this narrative into a comprehensive cosmological system that explained the soul's origin, its current condition, and its ultimate destiny. According to Orphic teaching, souls were fragments of divine essence that had become trapped in material bodies through a cosmic catastrophe involving the death and dismemberment of the god Dionysus. This theological framework provided both explanation for human suffering and hope for eventual spiritual liberation. The central Orphic myth described how the Titans murdered and consumed the infant Dionysus, incorporating his divine essence into their own beings before being destroyed by Zeus's thunderbolts. From the ashes of the Titans, humanity was created, inheriting both the divine nature of Dionysus and the corrupt nature of his murderers. This dual inheritance explained why humans possessed both spiritual aspirations and material appetites, while providing a theological justification for practices designed to purify the soul of its titanic corruption. Orphic purification practices involved dietary restrictions, ritual observances, and the study of sacred texts that provided both practical guidance for spiritual development and secret knowledge necessary for successful navigation of the underworld. The dietary requirements typically included abstinence from meat, beans, and other foods associated with death or corruption, reflecting beliefs about the relationship between physical consumption and spiritual purity. These restrictions served both as practical spiritual discipline and as visible markers of Orphic commitment. The Orphic gold tablets, discovered in graves throughout the Greek world, provided the most direct evidence of Orphic beliefs about post-mortem experience and the knowledge required for successful navigation of the underworld. These thin gold sheets, inscribed with instructions for the soul's journey after death, were placed with deceased Orphic initiates to serve as guides during their passage through the realm of the dead. The tablet's contents revealed sophisticated understanding of underworld geography and the challenges that souls would face during their post-mortem journey. The instructions contained on the gold tablets described specific locations within the underworld where souls would encounter crucial decision points that would determine their ultimate destiny. The most frequently mentioned location was a crossroads where souls would find two springs, one associated with memory and consciousness, the other with forgetfulness and spiritual dissolution. The tablets instructed souls to avoid the spring of Lethe, despite their overwhelming thirst, and to seek instead the spring of memory, whose waters would preserve their spiritual identity and enable their continued development. The geographical details provided by the Orphic tablets revealed a version of the Underworld that differed significantly from traditional descriptions, with specific landmarks and supernatural guardians that required proper passwords and ritual knowledge for safe passage. The tablets described a white cypress tree standing beside the Spring of Memory, guarded by supernatural beings who would challenge approaching souls to prove their worthiness for spiritual advancement. The correct responses to these challenges, preserved in the tablet's inscriptions, demonstrated the soul's Orphic initiation and its right to drink from the Spring of Memory. The social context in which Orphic tablets were used suggests that Orphic beliefs appealed particularly to individuals who possessed sufficient wealth to afford elaborate burial preparations, but who lacked the social connections or heroic achievements that traditional Greek religion associated with favourable post-mortem treatment. The tablets provided these individuals with alternative means of ensuring blessed afterlife conditions through personal spiritual preparation rather than dependence upon family status or divine favoritism. The theological sophistication of Orphic beliefs extended beyond simple promises of post-mortem benefits to encompass complex theories about the soul's nature, its relationship to the body, and its potential for development through multiple incarnations. Orphic teaching described the soul as essentially divine but temporarily imprisoned in material form, with death representing not termination, but liberation from physical constraints and opportunity for spiritual advancement. This conception of death as potentially beneficial stood in stark contrast to traditional Greek attitudes that viewed mortality as an unfortunate limitation of human existence. The Orphic concept of metempsychosis, or transmigration of souls, provided a framework for understanding how individual spiritual development could continue across multiple lifetimes, with each incarnation offering opportunities for purification and advancement toward ultimate liberation. This doctrine explained apparent inequalities in human circumstances as results of actions performed in previous lives, while offering hope that current spiritual efforts would improve future conditions. The belief in reincarnation also provided theological justification for Orphic ethical requirements, as violations of spiritual law would result in punishment through unfavourable rebirth rather than simply post-mortem suffering. The Dionysiac mysteries represented a third major category of Greek mystery religion, focused on the god Dionysus, and offering initiates participation in divine ecstasy that provided both immediate spiritual fulfillment and promises of favourable treatment after death. Unlike the agricultural focus of Eleusinian religion, or the philosophical sophistication of Orphic theology, Dionysiac mysteries emphasized direct emotional and physical experience of divine presence through ritual practices that temporarily dissolve the boundaries between human and divine consciousness. The mythological foundation of Dionysiac mysteries drew upon stories of the god's death and resurrection, his journeys to the underworld, and his triumph over the forces that sought to deny his divine nature. These narratives provided theological justification for ritual practices that involved temporary symbolic death and rebirth, allowing initiates to experience divine transformation while still living and to anticipate similar transformation after actual death. The emphasis on resurrection and renewal made Dionysiac religion particularly appealing to individuals seeking assurance that death would not represent final termination of consciousness or identity. The ritual practices associated with Dionysiac mysteries varied considerably across different regions and historical periods, but typically involved communal celebrations that combined wine consumption, theatrical performances, and ecstatic dancing designed to induce altered states of consciousness. These practices were understood not as mere entertainment or social gathering, but as religious techniques for achieving direct contact with divine reality and experiencing temporary liberation from the limitations of ordinary human consciousness. The social organisation of Dionysiac mystery groups differed significantly from the institutionalised structure of Eleusinian religion, with most groups organised as voluntary associations that met periodically for ritual celebrations, rather than maintaining permanent religious establishments. This organisational flexibility allowed Dionysiac religion to spread rapidly throughout the Mediterranean world, while adapting to local cultural conditions and religious preferences. The informal nature of most Dionysiac groups also made them more accessible to individuals who lack the resources or social connections required for participation in more formal mystery cults. The promise of blessed afterlife offered by Dionysiac mysteries emphasized continued participation in divine celebration and ecstasy, rather than the peaceful agricultural paradise promised by Eleusinian religion or the philosophical contemplation emphasized by Orphic teaching. Dionysiac initiates expected to join the gods' eternal revel in the underworld, experiencing perpetual joy and liberation from the constraints and sorrows that characterized mortal existence. This vision of the afterlife appealed particularly to individuals whose earthly circumstances provided limited opportunities for happiness or fulfillment. The influence of mystery religions on broader Greek attitudes toward death and the afterlife created significant tensions with traditional religious beliefs and practices, as the promise of individual salvation through secret knowledge challenged established concepts of cosmic justice and divine authority. Traditional Greek religion emphasized collective religious observance and the importance of maintaining proper relationships between human communities and the gods, while mystery religions focused on individual spiritual development and personal relationships with specific deities. The integration of mystery religious concepts into mainstream Greek culture occurred gradually through various mechanisms that allowed traditional and innovative beliefs to coexist without direct confrontation. Philosophical schools incorporated mystery religious concepts into broader theoretical frameworks that emphasized the soul's immortality and potential for development, while dramatic performances and artistic representations made mystery religious themes accessible to audiences who had not undergone formal initiation. Political leaders often supported mystery cults as sources of civic prestige and religious legitimacy, while maintaining their commitment to traditional public religious observances. The mystery religion's emphasis on individual spiritual preparation and secret knowledge created new categories of religious authority that competed with traditional sources of spiritual guidance. Mystery priests and teachers claimed access to divine revelations that transcended the knowledge available through conventional religious channels, while initiation into mystery cults provided individuals with spiritual credentials that were independent of their social status or family connections. This democratization of religious authority contributed to broader cultural changes that emphasized individual achievement and personal responsibility rather than collective identity and inherited status. The practical impact of mystery religious beliefs on Greek funeral practices and attitudes toward death became evident in the archaeological record through changes in burial customs, grave goods, and funerary inscriptions that reflected new concepts of post-mortem existence. This transformation did not occur uniformly across the Greek world, but varied significantly according to regional traditions, local mythologies, and contact with foreign religious systems. The evolution of underworld concepts from the Mycenaean period through the classical era reveals a complex process of cultural synthesis that incorporated indigenous beliefs, foreign influences, and philosophical innovations into an increasingly sophisticated understanding of death and the afterlife. Archaeological evidence from Mycenaean tomb complexes, particularly the shaft graves at Mycenae and the Tholos tombs throughout the Peloponnese, demonstrates that Bronze Age Greek concepts of death emphasized the continuation of social hierarchies and material relationships beyond the grave. The elaborate grave goods found in these burials, gold masks, weapons, jewellery, and vessels containing food and drink, suggest beliefs about the deceased's continued need for material possessions and social status markers in their post-mortem existence. The famous gold mask traditionally associated with Agamemnon, whether or not it actually belonged to the legendary king, exemplifies the Messenian practice of preserving the deceased's facial features and identity through precious metal craftsmanship. The architectural sophistication of Mycenaean burial monuments reveals concepts of death that emphasize permanence and continued presence rather than simple disposal of the deceased. The treasury of Atreus at Mycenae, with its massive stone construction and corbelled dome reaching over 40 feet in height, represents an enormous investment of resources and labour designed to create an eternal dwelling place for the deceased ruler. The dromos, or entrance passage, extends nearly 120 feet into the hillside, creating a processional approach that emphasised the solemnity and significance of visiting the tomb. The precision of the stonework, with blocks fitted so tightly that no mortar was required, demonstrates technical capabilities that were intended to ensure the structure's survival for eternity. Tomb paintings from Mycenaean sites, though fragmentary, provide glimpses of beliefs about the deceased's activities in their post-mortem existence. Frescoes from the Tomb of the Chariot at Tanagra depict processions of figures carrying offerings and participating in what appear to be funeral games or commemorative rituals. The artistic style emphasizes movement and celebration rather than mourning or finality, suggesting concepts of death as transformation rather than termination. The presence of chariots, horses, and hunting scenes in these paintings indicates beliefs that the deceased would continue to engage in the aristocratic activities that had defined their living identity. The transition from Mycenaean to early Iron Age burial practices reveals significant changes in concepts of death and the afterlife that coincided with broader cultural transformations following the Bronze Age collapse. The abandonment of monumental tomb construction and the shift towards simpler burial practices suggests either economic constraints or changing religious beliefs that placed less emphasis on material continuity beyond death. The archaeological record from the Dark Age period shows increasing standardization of burial practices across different regions, possibly reflecting the influence of epic poetry and shared cultural narratives about death and heroism. The emergence of geometric pottery styles in 8th century burials coincides with the development of more sophisticated artistic representations of death and funeral practices. Geometric amphoras and craters used as grave markers feature elaborate scenes of funeral processions, mourning rituals, and commemorative activities that provide detailed information about contemporary attitudes toward death. The Dipylon amphora, discovered in the Keramikos Cemetery at Athens, depicts a funeral scene with remarkable attention to detail, showing the deceased lying in state surrounded by mourners whose gestures and positioning convey specific emotional responses to death. Regional variations in underworld concepts become particularly evident when examining the diverse local traditions that developed across the Greek world during the Archaic period. The Western Greek colonies in Sicily and southern Italy, collectively known as Magna Graecia, developed distinctive interpretations of underworld mythology that reflected both their colonial origins and their contact with indigenous Italic peoples. The sanctuary of Persephone at Locri Epicepheri became a major centre for underworld worship that attracted devotees from across the Western Mediterranean, with archaeological evidence revealing ritual practices that differed significantly from those found at mainland Greek sites. The Locrian sanctuary's architectural layout incorporated elements that reflected local interpretations of Persephone's dual nature as both queen of the underworld and goddess of agricultural renewal. The temple complex included underground chambers that may have been used for mystery initiation rituals, while the surface structures featured decorative programs that emphasized the goddess's role in both death and regeneration. Terracotta reliefs from the site depict scenes of Persephone's abduction and return that include details not found in mainland Greek versions of the myth, suggesting local elaborations that reflected the specific concerns and beliefs of the Western Greek communities. The influence of Italic religious traditions on Greek underworld concepts in Magna Graecia becomes evident through the incorporation of chthonic deities and ritual practices that were foreign to traditional Greek religion. The worship of Dispater, an Italic underworld god who became identified with Hades, involved ritual practices that emphasized the earth's fertility and the connection between agricultural cycles and human mortality. These syncretic developments created regional variations in underworld mythology that preserved Greek narrative frameworks while incorporating local religious elements. Archaeological evidence from the Greek colonies in Asia Minor reveals different patterns of cultural synthesis, with underworld concepts influenced by contact with Lydian, Phrygian, and Persian religious traditions. The sanctuary of Cybele at Sardis included underground chambers and ritual installations that suggest mystery religious practices involving symbolic death and rebirth. The goddess's association with both the earth's fertility and the underworld's mysteries created theological frameworks that influence Greek concepts of post-mortem existence and divine judgment. The Persian conquest of the Ionian cities in the 6th century BC introduced Greek communities to Zoroastrian concepts of cosmic dualism and post-mortem judgment that significantly influenced later developments in underworld mythology. Zoroastrian beliefs about the soul's journey after death, including passage across a bridge that widened or narrowed according to the deceased's moral worth, provided models for the development of more sophisticated Greek concepts of individual judgment and moral accountability. The Zoroastrian emphasis on the cosmic struggle between good and evil influenced Greek philosophical interpretations of the underworld as a realm where divine justice was administered according to universal moral principles. The influence of Egyptian religious traditions on Greek underworld concepts became particularly significant following the establishment of Greek trading posts in the Nile Delta and the subsequent conquest of Egypt by Alexander the Great. Egyptian concepts of post-mortem judgment, including the weighing of the heart against the feather of Ma'at, provided models for the development of Greek beliefs about individual moral evaluation after death. The elaborate Egyptian funerary texts, including the Book of the Dead, offered detailed descriptions of the soul's journey through the underworld that influenced Greek concepts of post-mortem geography and the challenges faced by the deceased. The Ptolemaic period in Egypt saw extensive synthesis between Greek and Egyptian religious traditions, creating hybrid concepts of underworld deities and practices that influenced religious development throughout the Hellenistic world. The cult of Serapis, which combined attributes of Egyptian Osiris with Greek underworld deities, created new theological frameworks for understanding death and resurrection that appealed to both Greek and Egyptian devotees. The Serapeum at Alexandria became a major centre for mystery religious practices that incorporated both Greek and Egyptian concepts of post-mortem transformation and divine judgment. Mesopotamian influences on Greek underworld concepts, transmitted through various cultural contacts including trade relationships and military campaigns, contributed to the development of more complex concepts of cosmic geography and divine administration of justice. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, with its detailed descriptions of the underworld as a realm of dust and darkness ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal, provided narrative models that influenced Greek concepts of underworld geography and administration. The Mesopotamian emphasis on the underworld as a bureaucratic realm, with complex administrative procedures, influenced the development of Greek concepts of post-mortem judgment and soul processing. The influence of Mesopotamian flood narratives on Greek mythology created parallels between underworld punishment and cosmic justice that reinforced concepts of divine retribution for moral transgressions. The story of Utnapishtim's survival of the Great Flood provided models for Greek narratives about divine punishment of human wickedness that influenced concepts of underworld justice and the relationship between earthly behaviour and post-mortem consequences. The development of philosophical schools during the classical period created systematic reinterpretations of traditional underworld mythology, that transformed popular religious beliefs into sophisticated theoretical frameworks for understanding the soul's nature and destiny. The Pythagorean school's emphasis on mathematical harmony and numerical relationship influenced concepts of cosmic justice and the soul's journey through various states of existence. Pythagorean beliefs about metempsychosis provided theoretical justification for moral behaviour based on the soul's continued existence and potential for development across multiple lifetimes. Pythagorean concepts of purification through mathematical study and philosophical contemplation created alternative approaches to achieving favourable post-mortem conditions that competed with mystery religious practices while incorporating similar promises of spiritual transformation. The Pythagorean emphasis on the soul's essential divinity and its temporary imprisonment in material form influenced later Platonic concepts of death as liberation and the underworld as a realm of moral education and spiritual development. Platonic philosophy transformed traditional underworld mythology into allegories for psychological and metaphysical truths about the soul's relationship to ultimate reality. Plato's myth of presented in the Republic, reinterpreted traditional concepts of post-mortem judgment as educational processes designed to prepare souls for reincarnation and eventual liberation from the cycle of birth and death. The elaborate cosmic machinery described in this myth, including the spindle of necessity and the fates who governed reincarnation, created systematic theological frameworks that explained individual destiny in terms of cosmic justice and moral development. The Platonic Academy's influence on educated Greek attitudes toward death and the afterlife created intellectual frameworks that allowed traditional religious beliefs to coexist with sophisticated philosophical speculation about the soul's immortality and potential for development. Platonic concepts of the soul's tripartite nature and its relationship to eternal forms provided theoretical justification for beliefs about post-mortem existence, while transforming popular religious narratives into philosophical allegories about the human condition. Stoic philosophy developed different approaches to reinterpreting traditional underworld mythology, emphasizing the soul's relationship to cosmic reason and the importance of accepting natural processes, including death, as expressions of divine will. Stoic concepts of the soul's material nature and its eventual dissolution into the cosmic pneuma created alternative frameworks for understanding death that emphasized acceptance and resignation rather than hope for individual survival or post-mortem rewards. The Stoic emphasis on virtue as the only true good influenced concepts of post-mortem judgment by suggesting that external circumstances, including punishment or reward after death, were ultimately indifferent to the soul's essential well-being. This philosophical approach transformed traditional concepts of underworld justice by emphasizing the internal consequences of moral choices rather than external divine retribution or reward. The evolution of artistic representations of underworld scenes reveals changing attitudes toward death and divine justice that reflected broader cultural developments in Greek society. Early geometric pottery emphasized the social aspects of death and mourning, while classical red figure vases depicted more complex narratives about individual moral choice and divine judgment. The increasing sophistication of underworld iconography paralleled developments in religious thought and philosophical speculation about the soul's nature and destiny. The influence of dramatic poetry on popular concepts of the underworld created standardized narrative frameworks that spread throughout the Greek world while allowing for local variations and interpretations. Aeschylus's austere trilogy established influential concepts of divine justice and the transformation of primitive blood vengeance into civilized legal procedures, while Euripides' Alcestis explored themes of voluntary death and the possibility of return from the underworld that influenced popular attitudes toward mortality and divine mercy. The archaeological evidence from Greek burial sites throughout the Mediterranean reveals the practical impact of evolving underworld concepts on funeral practices and memorial customs. the increasing elaboration of grave monuments, and the inclusion of objects related to mystery religious initiation demonstrate growing belief in the soul's continued existence and the importance of proper preparation for post-mortem judgment. The standardization of certain burial practices across different regions suggests the influence of shared cultural narratives about death and the afterlife, while regional variations reveal the persistence of local traditions and beliefs. The standardization of certain burial practices across different regions suggests the influence of shared cultural narratives about death and the afterlife, while regional variations reveal the persistence of local traditions and beliefs. This complex tapestry of evolving Greek underworld concepts would prove remarkably durable, providing the foundational framework that Roman authors would adapt and transform for their own cultural purposes, creating interpretations that would profoundly influence Western civilization's understanding of death, judgment, and the afterlife for millennia to come. Roman adaptation of Greek underworld mythology began as early as the 3rd century BC, when Roman poets and historians first encountered sophisticated Greek literary treatments of death and post-mortem existence through their conquest of Greek territories in southern Italy and Sicily. The Romans possessed their own indigenous concepts of death and the afterlife, centered on the worship of ancestral spirits and the belief that proper funeral rites ensured the deceased's peaceful existence in the underworld realm of Dis Pater. However, the encounter with Greek mythological narratives provided Roman writers with far more elaborate and psychologically sophisticated frameworks for exploring themes of divine justice, moral accountability, and the relationship between earthly behaviour and eternal consequences. Virgil's Aeneid, composed during the Augustan period between 29 and 19 BC, represents the most influential Roman adaptation of Greek underworld traditions, transforming Homer's relatively simple Nicaea into an elaborate journey through a complex underworld geography that reflected Roman values, political concerns, and religious sensibilities. Virgil's Underworld served multiple functions within the epic's broader narrative structure. It provided Aeneas with prophetic knowledge about Rome's future destiny, demonstrated the hero's worthiness for his divine mission through his successful navigation of supernatural challenges, and offered Roman readers a comprehensive vision of post-mortem justice that incorporated both Greek mythological traditions and contemporary Roman religious beliefs. The geographical layout of Virgil's Underworld expanded significantly upon earlier Greek descriptions, incorporating regions and features that reflected Roman concerns about moral education, political legitimacy, and the relationship between individual virtue and collective destiny. The mourning fields, where souls who died for love wandered in eternal sorrow, provided space for exploring themes of passion and its consequences that resonated with Roman anxieties about the relationship between private emotion and public duty. The region designated for warriors who had died in battle reflected Roman military values, while acknowledging the tragic waste of life that characterized the civil wars that had dominated recent Roman history. Virgil's description of Tartarus as a place of punishment for cosmic criminals incorporated Greek narrative traditions, while emphasizing crimes that held particular significance for Roman audiences. The punishment of those who had betrayed their country or sold their loyalty for gold reflected contemporary concerns about political corruption and the breakdown of traditional Roman values during the late Republic. The eternal torment reserved for those who had committed incest or struck their parents addressed fundamental Roman anxieties about family relationships and the patria potesta system that formed the foundation of Roman social organisation. The Elysian fields in Virgil's Underworld served as more than simply a pleasant destination for virtuous souls. They functioned as a staging area for reincarnation and continued service to the cosmic order. The concept of souls drinking from lethe to forget their previous existence before returning to earthly life provided theological justification for the Roman belief in their civilization's destined expansion and the divine sanction for their imperial mission. The prophetic revelation that Aeneas receives about Rome's future greatness transforms the underworld visit from a personal quest into a cosmic validation of Roman imperial ideology. The influence of Stoic philosophy on Virgil's underworld concepts becomes evident through the emphasis placed on duty, acceptance of fate, and the subordination of individual desires to cosmic necessity. The shade of Anchises, Aeneas's father, serves as both personal guide and philosophical instructor, explaining how individual souls contribute to the larger patterns of divine providence that govern historical development. This integration of personal emotion with cosmic purpose reflects Stoic teachings about the relationship between individual virtue and universal reason, while providing Roman readers with frameworks for understanding their own roles in historical processes. The technical innovations that Virgil introduced in his underworld description influenced subsequent Roman literature and established narrative conventions that would persist throughout the imperial period. The detailed geographical mapping of different underworld regions provided later authors with standardized frameworks for exploring themes of moral judgment and spiritual development. The use of historical figures as inhabitants of various underworld locations created precedents for using the afterlife as a space for political and moral commentary on contemporary events and personalities. Early Christian encounters with classical underworld traditions created complex relationships of both adoption and rejection that would fundamentally shape Western concepts of hell, purgatory, and the afterlife. Christian theologians found themselves confronting sophisticated pagan narratives about post-mortem judgment, moral accountability, and the soul's potential for purification that offered both useful theological resources and dangerous theological competitors to emerging Christian doctrines about salvation and eternal punishment. The concept of individual moral judgment after death, which had developed gradually in Greek religious thought through the influence of mystery religions and philosophical speculation, provided early Christian writers with established frameworks for articulating beliefs about divine justice and the consequences of earthly behaviour. The Greek tradition of underworld judges who evaluated souls according to their moral worth offered precedents for Christian concepts of final judgment, while the geographical division of the underworld into regions of punishment and reward provided models for the development of Christian concepts of hell and heaven. However, Christian adaptation of classical underworld traditions required significant theological modifications to align with monotheistic beliefs and the central role of Christ in human salvation. The multiple gods and goddesses who governed different aspects of death and judgment in Greek mythology had to be either eliminated or transformed into angels, demons, or allegorical figures that could function within Christian theological frameworks. The concept of fate, which played a central role in Greek underworld mythology, required reinterpretation in terms of divine providence and human free will to accommodate Christian beliefs about moral responsibility and divine grace. The development of Christian concepts of purgatory drew heavily upon classical traditions of post-mortem, purification, and moral education that had been elaborated in Platonic philosophy and mystery religious practices. The idea that souls could undergo purification after death to prepare for eventual salvation provided theological solutions to problems about the fate of individuals who died in states of imperfect virtue, while maintaining the necessity of moral accountability for earthly actions. The geographical conception of purgatory as a mountain or series of terraces reflected classical models of underworld geography, while adapting them to serve Christian theological purposes. The classical tradition of heroic descent into the underworld provided narrative models for Christian accounts of Christ's descent into hell, an event that became central to Christian understanding of salvation and the defeat of death. The theological significance of this descent drew upon established patterns of divine figures entering the realm of the dead to rescue imprisoned souls, while transforming these narratives to emphasize Christ's unique role as universal saviour. The classical precedents of Orpheus's musical persuasion of underworld authorities and Heracles' physical conquest of underworld guardians provided narrative frameworks that could be adapted to express Christian beliefs about the triumph of divine love and power over death and damnation. The influence of classical underworld traditions on early Christian art and literature becomes evident through the adoption of iconographic elements and narrative structures that have been developed in pagan contexts but could be reinterpreted to serve Christian purposes. The figure of Charon, the ferryman of the dead, appeared in early Christian art as a demonic figure who could be overcome through faith and divine grace. The three-headed dog Cerberus became a symbol of the threefold nature of sin or death that could be conquered through Christian virtue. The rivers of the underworld were reinterpreted as barriers between salvation and damnation that could be crossed through proper spiritual preparation and divine assistance. The synthesis of classical and Christian traditions reached its most sophisticated expression in Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, composed in the early 14th century. Dante's epic poem created a comprehensive vision of the afterlife that incorporated classical geographical and narrative frameworks while transforming them to serve Christian theological purposes and contemporary political commentary. The poem's structure as a journey through hell, purgatory and paradise reflected classical models of underworld descent while presenting a thoroughly Christian understanding of moral development and spiritual salvation. Dante's Hell drew extensively upon classical descriptions of underworld punishment while organising these torments according to Christian moral theology and contemporary political concerns. The 9 circles of hell reflected both the numerical symbolism that characterized medieval Christian thought and the geographical stratification that had characterized classical underworld descriptions since Hesiod's Theogony. The specific punishments assigned to different categories of sinners incorporated classical examples, like Tantalus and Sisyphus, while adding contemporary figures whose crimes reflected the political and moral concerns of Dante's own era. The figure of Virgil as Dante's guide through hell and purgatory represented the complex relationship between classical wisdom and Christian revelation that characterized medieval intellectual culture. Virgil's knowledge of classical underworld traditions qualified him to serve as guide through the regions of punishment and purification, while his status as a pagan soul excluded him from the Christian paradise that required divine grace for access. This limitation reflected medieval Christian attitudes toward classical learning as valuable but insufficient for ultimate spiritual salvation. Dante's Purgatory elaborated upon classical and early Christian concepts of post-mortem purification by creating a detailed geography of moral education that demonstrated how souls could overcome the consequences of earthly sins through proper spiritual discipline. The 7 terraces of Mount Purgatory corresponded to the 7 deadly sins, while incorporating classical concepts of moral development and philosophical education. The integration of classical philosophical traditions with Christian sacramental theology created a comprehensive vision of spiritual development that influenced subsequent Western understanding of moral psychology and religious practice. The influence of Dante's synthesis extended far beyond literature to shape Western artistic, theological, and philosophical traditions for centuries. The poem's detailed descriptions of afterlife geography provided artists with standardized iconographic frameworks for depicting themes of judgment, punishment, and salvation. The theological sophistication of Dante's moral psychology influenced subsequent Christian thought about the relationship between reason and faith, while the poem's political commentary established precedents for using afterlife narratives to address contemporary social and political concerns. Renaissance humanist scholars developed new approaches to classical underworld traditions that emphasized their literary and philosophical value while maintaining Christian theological commitments. The rediscovery of complete texts of classical authors provided Renaissance readers with more comprehensive understanding of Greek and Roman religious beliefs, while humanist educational programs promoted the study of classical literature as essential preparation for Christian scholarship and civic leadership. This cultural synthesis created intellectual frameworks that allowed classical and Christian traditions to coexist and mutually enrich each other rather than existing in theological opposition. The influence of Renaissance humanism on artistic representations of underworld themes becomes evident through the increasing sophistication and classical accuracy of depictions of mythological scenes involving death and judgment. Artists like Michelangelo incorporated classical underworld imagery into Christian contexts, as seen in the Last Judgment fresco in the Sistine Chapel, where classical figures like Charon and Minos appear alongside Christian saints and angels. This synthesis reflected broader Renaissance attitudes toward the compatibility of classical learning and Christian faith when properly understood and applied. The development of Protestant theology during the Reformation created new approaches to classical underworld traditions that emphasized their value as moral instruction while rejecting their theological authority. Protestant reformers like John Calvin acknowledged the moral wisdom contained in classical accounts of divine justice and post-mortem punishment, while maintaining that only Christian revelation provided reliable knowledge about the soul's eternal destiny. This approach allowed Protestant scholars to appreciate classical literature and philosophy as preparation for Christian understanding, while maintaining clear distinctions between human wisdom and divine revelation. The Enlightenment period saw the development of rationalist approaches to classical underworld traditions that emphasized their psychological and symbolic significance while questioning their literal truth claims. Philosophers like David Hume and Voltaire analysed classical myths about death and judgment as products of human imagination and social conditioning, rather than divine revelation or historical fact. This analytical approach created new frameworks for understanding the cultural and psychological functions served by religious narratives about death and the afterlife. The emergence of historical criticism during the 18th and 19th centuries provided new tools for understanding the development and cultural significance of classical underworld traditions. Scholars like Friedrich August Wolff and Karl Ottfried Müller applied historical and philological methods to trace the evolution of Greek and Roman religious beliefs while identifying the social and political factors that influenced their development. This scholarly approach created more nuanced understanding of how cultural contact, political change, and intellectual development had shaped ancient concepts of death and divine justice. The influence of Romantic literature on interpretations of classical underworld themes emphasized their emotional and imaginative power, while exploring their relevance to contemporary psychological and spiritual concerns. Poets like Lord Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley drew upon classical narratives about underworld descent and divine rebellion to explore themes of individual freedom, cosmic justice, and the relationship between human creativity and divine authority. The Romantic emphasis on imagination and emotional authenticity created new approaches to classical mythology that valued psychological truth over historical accuracy. Modern psychological interpretations of classical underworld traditions, particularly those influenced by Carl Jung's analytical psychology, have identified archetypal patterns and symbolic structures that transcend specific cultural and historical contexts. Jung's concept of the collective unconscious provided theoretical frameworks for understanding why similar patterns of underworld imagery appear across different cultures and historical periods. The archetypal interpretation of underworld descent as representing psychological individuation and the confrontation with unconscious contents has influenced contemporary therapeutic practices and spiritual development programs. Jungian analysis of classical underworld myths identifies recurring symbolic elements that represent universal aspects of human psychological development. The descent into darkness represents the necessary confrontation with unconscious contents that must be integrated for psychological wholeness. The encounter with guardians and obstacles symbolizes the resistance that consciousness encounters when attempting to access unconscious wisdom. The return to the upper world with new knowledge or transformed perspective represents the integration of unconscious insights into conscious awareness. Contemporary cultural applications of classical underworld themes continue to demonstrate their enduring relevance for exploring fundamental human concerns about mortality, moral accountability, and the meaning of existence. Modern literature, film, and other artistic media regularly draw upon classical narrative patterns and symbolic frameworks to address contemporary anxieties about death, justice, and spiritual significance. The persistence of these themes across different cultural contexts and technological environments suggests their continued psychological and spiritual relevance for human experience. The influence of classical underworld traditions on contemporary psychology, literature, and popular culture demonstrates the enduring power of these ancient narratives to illuminate fundamental aspects of human experience that transcend specific historical and cultural circumstances. From Virgil's imperial vision to Dante's Christian synthesis, from Renaissance humanism to modern psychological interpretation, the Greek underworld has provided successive generations with frameworks for understanding death, justice, and the human condition. This remarkable continuity reflects not merely the preservation of ancient texts, but the ongoing relevance of the psychological and spiritual insights they contain. The legacy of Greek underworld mythology and Western civilization extends beyond literary and artistic influence to encompass fundamental concepts of individual moral responsibility, divine justice, and the relationship between earthly behavior and ultimate meaning that continue to shape legal, ethical, and religious thought. The evolution of these concepts from their origins in Bronze Age burial practices through their sophisticated elaboration in classical literature and philosophy to their continued influence in contemporary culture demonstrates the enduring human need to find meaning in mortality and hope in the face of death's apparent finality.